My name is Harper. I am 32 years old and I am a financial auditor in Chicago. I have always believed in the unconditional value of family. I spent my entire life thinking that blood meant absolute loyalty and that sacrifice would eventually be met with love and mutual respect. I was the one who always showed up for the holidays, cooked the meals, and remembered the birthdays. But right now, I am standing in a dimly lit hallway, outside a glass-walled conference room, and my entire perspective on human nature has completely changed. Inside that room, my older brother Jason and his wife Maya are currently popping a bottle of incredibly expensive champagne. Maya is a highly ambitious African-American luxury real estate director, and I can easily see the heavy diamonds on her wrist flashing under the bright overhead lights as she pours the drinks. They are celebrating with intense joy. They are laughing loudly, with their heads thrown back, absolutely certain they have just successfully stolen a $20 million inheritance. For them, this moment is the ultimate victory they have been waiting for. They spent the last 3 weeks treating me like absolute dirt on their shoes. They called me a selfish burden directly to my face without a single ounce of hesitation. They spun vicious, complicated lies to turn the rest of our extended family against me, and they tried their absolute hardest to kick me to the curb like a stray dog. They thought my polite silence meant I was weak and incapable of defending myself against their high-powered tactics. They thought because I never fought back when we were growing up, that I would just roll over and let them take everything that mattered in this world. What they do not know is that the worn leather briefcase I am holding right now in my trembling hands holds the absolute death sentence to their unbelievable greed. Inside this bag is the undeniable physical proof of their heinous crimes and the final written words of the man they thought they so cleverly outsmarted. They thought they were dealing with a naive little sister, but they forgot they are dealing with a financial auditor who makes a living finding hidden truths. Before I walk through those heavy wooden doors and show you exactly how their smug, triumphant smiles turned into pure, absolute terror, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. But only if you genuinely enjoy stories about justice served incredibly cold. And please drop a comment letting me know what state or country you are watching from right now and what time it is there. I read every single one of your comments, and I truly love connecting with you all. Now let me take you back to where this entire nightmare truly began. It was exactly 3 weeks ago on a miserable Tuesday afternoon that the earth completely fell out from under my feet. We had just buried Grandpa William. The cemetery was extremely cold, and the harsh winter wind was biting right through my thin black coat, chilling me to the bone. My eyes were completely swollen and red from crying all morning during the service. Grandpa William was the only person in my family who actually saw me for who I am. He was the one who raised me when our own parents were too busy with their own complicated lives to care about a quiet little girl. He was my rock, my mentor, and my entire world. I was walking slowly back to my car in the gravel parking lot, trying to steady my erratic breathing and figure out how I was going to navigate a world without him in it. I felt completely shattered and utterly alone. I had not even reached my car door when a heavy, aggressive hand clamped down hard on my upper arm. I spun around, completely startled and terrified by the sudden physical contact. It was Jason. His face was not twisted in grief or sadness over losing our grandfather. His eyes were wide and manic with a strange, dark energy that made my stomach turn. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not pull me into a warm hug to comfort his deeply grieving younger sister the way a normal brother would. His grip just tightened on my arm until it actually bruised my skin through my heavy coat. He looked around the empty parking lot to make sure no one was close by and leaned in uncomfortably close to my face. He demanded the keys to the metal safe of Grandpa William. He said he knew I had them in my purse and he needed them right that very second because he had important business to settle. I stood there, staring at my own brother, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity and timing of his demand. The dirt on the grave was quite literally not even settled yet. My tears were still actively wet on my cheeks. I told Jason to let go of me immediately and explained that this was neither the time nor the place to talk about safes or belongings or inheritance. That is exactly when Maya stepped out from behind a parked car to join him. Her expensive designer heels crunched aggressively against the loose gravel as she quickly closed the distance between us. She was wearing a custom black morning dress that looked far more suited for a high-fashion runway event than a solemn suburban funeral service. Maya did not have a single ounce of sympathy in her gaze. She looked at me the way you would look at an annoying insect on your windshield that you just wanted to scrape away. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, and her voice dropped into a tone so icy and cold it made the winter wind feel warm by comparison. She told me I was going to hand over the keys to the house and the keys to the hidden safe right now, or she was going to pull out her smartphone and call the police. She loudly claimed I had no legal right to withhold family property from the rightful heirs, and that she would gladly have me arrested in the cemetery parking lot if I made things difficult for them. I felt physically sick to my stomach hearing those threatening words. Maya is a very successful director of luxury real estate, and she knows exactly how to intimidate people to get her way in corporate boardrooms. She uses her loud, commanding presence to force compliance, and Jason just stands cowardly behind her, letting her do all the dirty work while he reaps the benefits. I tried to reason with both of them despite my shaking voice and my blurry vision. I gently explained that we needed to wait for the lawyers to contact us and that we deeply needed to respect the grieving process for the beautiful man who just died. Jason scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes, and told me to stop being so incredibly dramatic. He said the old man was dead and that we needed to secure the valuable assets before the state stepped in and took their cut of the money. The casual cruelty in his voice was staggering and broke my heart all over again. They had not visited Grandpa William in well over a year. Maya always complained that his house smelled weird and dusty, and Jason always said he was too busy making highly profitable deals to drive out to the suburbs to see him. But the very moment his heart stopped beating, they were suddenly deeply and aggressively concerned about his private belongings and whatever cash they thought he had hidden away. I pulled my arm away from Jason using all my remaining strength and flatly refused to give them anything. I told them they would have to go through the proper legal channels, just like everyone else in the world. Maya pulled out her cell phone and actually started dialing numbers with a furious expression on her flawless face. She was not bluffing to scare me. She was completely ready to drag my name through the mud and cause a massive, embarrassing scene while the rest of the funeral guests were still pulling out of the driveway down the hill. I had to make a split-second decision to protect myself from their toxic attack. I turned my back on them, got into my car, and instantly locked the doors. Maya slammed her manicured hand against my driver's side window, shouting something vicious that I could not hear over the sound of my engine starting. I drove away from the cemetery with my hands shaking violently on the steering wheel while I gasped for air trying to calm a panic attack. I could see them clearly in my rearview mirror, standing together in the gray afternoon light, looking furiously after my departing car. That parking lot confrontation was the exact moment I realized my brother was forever gone. He had been entirely replaced by a greedy, desperate stranger who viewed our grandfather's tragic death as nothing more than a highly profitable financial transaction waiting to be cashed in. The hostility was so immediate and so vicious that I knew this was only the beginning of a very dark and painful war. They had drawn the battle lines right there on the sacred ground where we laid our grandfather to rest. I drove home completely blind with tears, wondering how I was going to fight against two people who clearly had no moral bottom line. I did not know yet just how far they were willing to go, or the horrifying, illegal lengths they would resort to in order to get what they wanted. I just knew that the family I thought I had was dead, and the people coming after me were absolutely ruthless. To anyone driving past his property, Grandpa William looked like a man who had absolutely nothing. He lived in a tiny rundown two-bedroom house at the very edge of the suburbs. The paint on the wooden siding had faded to a dull, washed-out gray years ago, and the front porch always groaned loudly under my feet whenever I walked up the cracked concrete steps. Parked in the narrow driveway was his ultimate pride and joy, a rusting 1998 pickup truck that rattled violently whenever he managed to turn the key. The wheel wells were eaten away by salt and winter snow, and the interior smelled strongly of old leather and stale peppermint. To the rest of the wealthy modern world, it was just another decaying property belonging to an old man who had been completely left behind by society. But to me, that house was the only place on entire Earth where I truly felt safe and valued. Every single weekday, my alarm went off at 5 in the morning. I would spend 10 grueling, highly stressful hours staring at complex spreadsheets and auditing tax documents under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of my financial firm in downtown Chicago. The corporate environment was completely ruthless. By the time I finally clocked out for the day, my eyes would be burning from the blue light of the monitors, and my back would ache terribly from sitting perfectly rigid in a cheap office chair. But I never went straight back to the quiet comfort of my own apartment. Instead, I would get into my car, merge onto the packed highway, and sit through 40 minutes of heavy, agonizing evening traffic just to get to Grandpa William. I did not do this out of a sense of forced obligation or family guilt. I did it out of pure, unconditional love. I would walk through his squeaky front door and immediately get to work without even taking off my coat. I cooked his dinners from scratch, carefully chopping fresh vegetables and making sure the meats were tender enough for him to eat comfortably. I would sit at his small scratched kitchen table and sort his various medications into a plastic weekly pill organizer, double and triple checking the complicated dosages to make sure he never missed a vital pill for his failing heart. After dinner, we would sit together in the quiet living room while I meticulously balanced his checkbook, organized his modest utility bills, and made sure he was not getting taken advantage of by predatory mail scams. He would always offer to pay me for my time, reaching into his worn leather wallet and trying to hand me a crumpled $20 bill with his shaking, calloused hands. I always pushed the money right back into his palm, gently kissing his weathered cheek. He had stepped up and raised me when our own parents walked away to start new lives without us. He had worked grueling physical labor jobs until his joints gave out, just to make sure Jason and I always had warm winter coats and hot food on the table. Taking care of him in his final vulnerable years was not a burden to me. It was the absolute greatest honor of my entire life. My older brother Jason and his wife Maya lived in an entirely different universe. Maya was a highly aggressive, wildly successful director of luxury real estate, closing massive multi-million-dollar deals for high-net-worth clients across the city. She drove a brand-new, pristine white luxury SUV that cost more than my entire annual salary. Jason had completely reinvented his entire personality to fit seamlessly into her glamorous, high-stakes world. He wore custom-tailored suits, imported Italian shoes, and perfectly styled hair. Together, they projected the ultimate flawless image of modern wealth and unstoppable corporate success. They lived in a sprawling modern penthouse downtown, filled with minimalist white furniture and abstract art that I was not even allowed to sit on when I visited. To Jason and Maya, Grandpa William was nothing more than an embarrassing stain on their carefully curated aesthetic. They looked at his rusted truck, his faded flannel shirts, and his modest lifestyle with absolute undisguised disgust. They never visited him. Not on Thanksgiving, not on Christmas, not even on his 80th birthday. Whenever I called Jason to beg him to just spend one single hour with the man who raised us, he always had a perfectly polished excuse, locked and loaded. He would claim they were simply too busy building their empire, or that Maya was hosting an exclusive networking event for wealthy foreign investors. They treated family relationships exactly like a networking opportunity, and since Grandpa William appeared to have absolutely nothing to offer them financially or socially, they completely erased him from their busy schedules. I watched Grandpa wait by the window on holidays, wearing his best button-down shirt, hoping his only grandson would pull into the driveway. The sheer heartbreak on his wrinkled face when the sun went down and the streetlights turned on without a single knock at the door completely shattered my soul. I would hold his hand and tell him the roads were bad, or that Jason had a last-minute business flight, but we both knew the painful truth. My brother had traded his heart, and his loyalty for a piece of the corporate elite. Maya actively encouraged this distance. She would openly complain that driving out to the suburbs was a waste of gas and that she felt completely unsafe leaving her expensive vehicle parked in such a rundown neighborhood. They wanted the pristine image of a perfect, successful family without doing any of the actual heavy lifting or showing any genuine compassion. The absolute peak of their heartless cruelty happened during a freezing week in early February. Grandpa had caught a terrible respiratory virus and was completely confined to his bed. He was incredibly weak, coughing constantly, and I was terrified he might develop severe pneumonia. I spent my entire Sunday afternoon making a massive batch of his absolute favorite chicken and wild rice soup from scratch. I simmered the rich broth for hours, carefully shredding the chicken and packing it into large, heavy-duty plastic containers so he could easily microwave it throughout the week. But on Monday morning, a massive financial crisis hit my accounting firm. A major corporate client was facing a sudden emergency audit from the IRS, and my managing partner demanded I stay at the office until late into the night. I was absolutely frantic because I knew Grandpa had nothing nutritious to eat in his refrigerator and he was too weak to stand at the stove. I looked at a digital map and realized Jason and Maya had to drive directly past Grandpa's highway exit on their way to an exclusive country club dinner event they had been bragging about all week. I swallowed my immense pride, pulled out my phone and called my brother. I practically begged him to just swing by my office building, grab the bag of soup, and drop it off at the house. I promised it would only take 10 extra minutes out of their evening. Jason sighed heavily into the receiver, sounding incredibly put out by the massive inconvenience, but he finally agreed to do it. I ran down to the rainy lobby and handed the warm plastic containers through the passenger window of Maya's pristine white SUV. Maya did not even look at me. She pinched the plastic grocery bag between two perfectly manicured fingers with an expression of pure revulsion, as if I was handing her a bag of toxic medical waste. I thanked them profusely and went back upstairs feeling a massive wave of relief, knowing Grandpa would have a hot meal. The next afternoon, I finally managed to leave work early and visit Grandpa. When I opened his ancient refrigerator to get him a bowl of the soup, the shelves were completely bare. There was nothing inside but a half-empty carton of milk and some stale bread. I walked back into the bedroom and gently asked him if he enjoyed the meal I sent over with Jason. Grandpa looked up at me with a confused, gentle smile and told me Jason never came by. My heart dropped straight into my stomach. I immediately pulled out my phone and called my brother. Maya answered the phone instead of him. I asked her exactly where the food was. I will never forget the casual, icy tone of her voice echoing through the speaker. She let out a highly annoyed sigh and told me she threw the entire bag into a trash can at a gas station right off the highway. I was completely speechless. My brain could not process the absolute malice of her actions. I asked her why she would do something so unbelievably cruel to a sick old man who desperately needed food. Maya calmly replied that the smell of garlic and cooked chicken was seeping out of the plastic containers, and she was absolutely not about to let my cheap homemade soup ruin the custom leather interior of her brand new vehicle. She told me to just order him a pizza online, like a normal person, and hung up the phone, leaving me standing there listening to the dial tone. I stood in Grandpa's quiet kitchen, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned bone white. The rage inside me was a physical burning fire spreading through my veins. I wanted to drive to their gleaming downtown penthouse, kick down their custom door, and scream until my voice completely gave out. I wanted to tear their perfect, pristine life apart. But I looked out into the hallway and saw Grandpa sleeping peacefully in his armchair, looking so incredibly fragile and small, wrapped in a knitted blanket. If I started a massive, explosive family war right now, it would only cause him more stress and heartbreak in his final years. He did not need the drama. He needed peace. So I swallowed the intense, burning pain. I pushed the fiery anger deep down into my chest and locked it away behind an iron door. I smiled softly, went to the stove, and started making him a brand new meal from scratch, using whatever ingredients I had in my car. I kept quiet to keep the peace. I let them believe they had won. I let Jason and Maya think I was just a weak, passive girl who would simply accept their endless disrespect and cruelty without a fight. But I never forgot that moment. Every single day, I filed away their extreme arrogance and their heartless actions in my mind, building a meticulous, silent record of their true character. I just did not know yet how soon that specific record would become the most valuable weapon of my entire life. The shift happened in late October as the autumn leaves began turning brown. Jason drove out to Grandpa William's house for the first time in over 14 months. He did not come to check on his failing health or spend quality time with the man who raised us. He came because he needed a signature on some obscure tax document related to an old family property line. I was at my accounting firm wrapping up a grueling quarterly audit. Jason arrived at the house while the mail carrier was walking up the driveway. My brother always had a habit of overstepping boundaries. Instead of bringing the stack of envelopes inside and leaving them on the kitchen counter like a normal person, he started sifting through them. One letter caught his eye. It was printed on thick cream cardstock and bore the embossed logo of an elite wealth management firm headquartered in downtown Chicago. Jason knew that firm. Maya had actively tried to secure a luxury real estate partnership with them and failed because they only handled ultra-high net worth clients. His greed instantly overpowered any basic sense of human decency. Standing right there on the creaky wooden porch, he tore open the sealed envelope addressed to our grandfather. He pulled out the quarterly financial statement, and his eyes scanned the numbers. That single sheet of paper completely shattered the false reality my brother had constructed in his mind. What Jason held in his hands was undeniable concrete proof that the poor old man he mocked and ignored for years was a silent multimillionaire. The statement detailed a massive, highly diversified portfolio of early commercial real estate investments that had exploded in value over the last 40 years. Grandpa William owned prime downtown retail spaces, luxury apartment buildings, and lucrative commercial plots across the state. All of these assets were securely held within an ironclad blind trust valued at over $20 million. Grandpa had purposely lived a humble, quiet life in a run-down suburban house because he valued simplicity and peace over flashy displays of wealth. He never wanted his money to ruin his family or attract greedy opportunists. Jason stood frozen on the porch, staring at a net worth dwarfing Maya's entire real estate career. His mind immediately went to work, running calculations. He realized that the rusting pickup truck and the faded flannel shirts were just a quiet disguise. More importantly, he realized that he had spent the last decade completely alienating the man who held the key to generational wealth. The sheer panic of potentially losing out on $20 million must have hit him like a freight train. He shoved the document into his designer jacket pocket, hiding the evidence of his discovery. He walked into the house with a fake smile plastered across his face and began a terrifying, calculated campaign to rewrite history. The change in their behavior was so sudden and jarring, it actually gave me whiplash. By the very next weekend, Jason and Maya had completely flipped their entire script. I arrived on a Saturday morning carrying my usual bags of fresh groceries, only to find Maya's pristine white luxury SUV parked squarely in the driveway. I walked through the front door and nearly dropped my bags in pure shock. Maya was standing in the small kitchen, wearing a designer apron over her silk blouse, aggressively arranging store-bought pastries onto a floral serving platter. Jason was sitting on the old sofa, laughing loudly at a story Grandpa was trying to tell. Maya rushed over to me with a wide, terrifyingly bright smile and tried to take the heavy grocery bags out of my hands. She told me I worked far too hard at my accounting firm and that she and Jason were finally going to step up and take over the caregiving duties. She actually had the nerve to look me dead in the eye and say that family meant everything to them. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. This was the exact same woman who had thrown away my homemade chicken soup in a gas station trash can just months prior because it smelled too much like an old person. Now she was pouring imported organic tea and calling him her favorite father figure. The sheer hypocrisy made me want to scream, but they played the part of doting, loving family members with absolute terrifying perfection. Their sudden extreme devotion was not just about getting close to Grandpa William. It was a highly coordinated, aggressive strategy to physically and emotionally push me entirely out of the picture. They started showing up unannounced every evening, right when I usually arrived from work. They completely took over the living room, speaking loudly over me and physically blocking me from sitting next to his armchair. When I tried to organize his medications, Maya would snatch the plastic pill boxes right out of my hands, insisting with a sickly sweet voice that she had already handled it. They began taking him to entirely new, expensive private doctors, without telling me and purposefully leaving my name off the authorized medical contact forms. Jason started making passive-aggressive comments right in front of Grandpa, claiming that I looked incredibly stressed and that I was clearly buckling under the pressure of my job. They tried to paint a picture of me as an unstable, exhausted woman who desperately needed to be relieved of her heavy burdens. They even went as far as changing the locks on the front and back doors, claiming there had been a string of burglaries in the neighborhood. They conveniently forgot to give me a new key. I was forced to stand on the porch, ringing the doorbell like a common stranger, waiting for Maya to open the door with a smug, victorious smirk. They were building a solid, impenetrable wall around the $20 million prize and systematically locking me out in the cold. It happened on a Thursday evening in late November, just as the first bitter frost began to cover the Chicago suburbs. I was sitting at my office desk running final audits on a massive corporate tax account when my cell phone vibrated violently against the wood. The caller ID flashed the name of Grandpa William's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. My heart instantly dropped completely into my stomach. When I answered, her voice was utterly frantic and breathless. She told me she had looked out her kitchen window and saw Grandpa collapse on his front porch while picking up the newspaper. The paramedics were already on their way. I did not even bother grabbing my winter coat or my heavy laptop bag. I sprinted out of the high-rise building and drove like an absolute maniac through the slick, rain-soaked streets, praying to God that I would not be too late. By the time I slammed my car into park, outside the emergency room, sliding on the wet pavement, my entire body was shaking uncontrollably. I ran through the sliding glass doors, demanding to know where he was. A sympathetic nurse with kind, tired eyes pulled me aside immediately there. She guided me into a small, sterile family waiting room and held my trembling hands. She delivered the exact words that shattered my entire universe into a million pieces. He had suffered a massive, catastrophic heart attack. His heart simply gave out before the ambulance even reached the hospital driveway. I collapsed into a cheap vinyl waiting room chair, burying my face in my hands, and wept until I could not physically pull air into my lungs. The grief was an overwhelming physical weight pressing down on my chest, crushing the absolute breath right out of my completely broken body. He was gone. The only man who had ever truly loved me, who had protected me from the coldness of my own parents, was just gone forever. I sat in that bleak, sterile room for nearly 3 hours, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the loss. The hospital staff brought me bad coffee in a styrofoam cup, but I could not bring myself to drink a single drop. I pulled out my phone and dialed Jason's number with trembling fingers, leaving 4 desperate voicemails begging him to call me back, begging him to come to the quiet hospital room. I needed him so we could support each other through this horrific tragedy. I called Maya as well, but her phone went straight to voicemail every single time. I assumed they were busy wrapping up some massive luxury real estate deal or attending a high society dinner, completely unaware that our family had just been permanently broken. I signed the necessary hospital paperwork with a hand that felt completely numb and detached from my own body. The doctors gave me a small plastic bag containing Grandpa's personal effects, his worn leather wallet, his silver reading glasses, and his analog wristwatch. Holding that small plastic bag broke my heart all over again. I finally walked out of the hospital into the freezing midnight air, feeling completely hollowed out and utterly devastated. I desperately needed comfort. I needed to smell his old books, to sit in his worn armchair, to just be somewhere that felt like him. So I got into my car and drove straight toward his tiny suburban house. I drove mechanically, my mind entirely blank, my eyes swollen and burning from shedding so many tears. I expected to find the house completely dark and completely perfectly silent inside tonight. I wanted a quiet sanctuary where I could sit alone and mourn the greatest man I had ever known in absolute peace. I was utterly unprepared for the horrific scene that was actually waiting for me. As I turned my car onto his familiar dark street, my headlights swept across the front of his property and my foot slammed hard onto the brake pedal. Every single light inside the house was blazing brightly, cutting through the darkness of the sleeping neighborhood. Maya's pristine white luxury SUV was parked aggressively across the front lawn, crushing the small, delicate, beautiful flower bed there. Grandpa had carefully planted those flowers just last spring. Next to her expensive vehicle was a large, unmarked commercial van. As I scrambled out of my car, still wearing my thin work clothes in the freezing wind, I heard the high-pitched mechanical scream of a heavy-duty power drill. A stranger in a thick canvas work jacket was standing at the front door, aggressively drilling the brass lock right out of the wood. The metal shavings were falling onto the welcome mat. I ran up the cracked concrete steps, screaming at the man to completely stop his illegal actions. I asked him what on earth he thought he was doing to my grandfather's house. The locksmith barely glanced at me over his shoulder, calmly stating he had been hired by the legal owners of the property to secure the premises immediately. I was completely confused, my grief-stricken brain struggling to process his cold words. Legal owners. That phrase made absolutely no sense at all. I pushed past the man entirely operating on pure adrenaline and defensive instinct. That is exactly when my foot caught on something heavy, sitting carelessly on the middle of the wooden front porch floor. I looked down and felt the blood drain entirely from my face. There were 5 massive, heavy-duty black trash bags sitting in a haphazard pile right next to the porch railing. One of the bags had ripped open near the top, spilling its contents onto the freezing concrete. It was my favorite comfortable cardigan, the one I always kept draped over the kitchen chair for those chilly evenings when I cooked his dinners. Peeking out from under it were my spare audit notebooks, my personalized coffee mug, and the expensive blood pressure monitor I had bought for him recently. Every single item I kept at that house, every trace of my loving presence as his devoted caregiver, had been violently swept up and thrown into garbage bags like worthless, contaminated trash. I stood on the porch, staring down at my belongings, completely unable to breathe. The profound disrespect was absolutely staggering and sickening. Before I could even reach down to pick up my sweater, the front door swung open completely. Maya stood perfectly framed in the doorway, looking like an absolute queen surveying her conquered territory. She was wearing a tailored beige trench coat over a designer black pantsuit. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was absolutely flawless. She did not look like a woman mourning the sudden tragic death of a family patriarch. She looked exactly like a ruthless corporate predator who had just successfully executed a highly profitable hostile takeover. She held a steaming mug of Grandpa's favorite chamomile tea in her perfectly manicured hand, taking a slow, deliberate sip before finally making eye contact with me. I demanded to know what was going on, asking her why my things were sitting in the dirt and where my older brother Jason was right now tonight. Maya let out a small, sharp laugh that contained absolutely zero humor. She did not offer a single word of condolence for my immense personal loss. She did not ask how the hospital visit went or how Grandpa passed away. Instead, she calmly reached into the deep pocket of her expensive trench coat and pulled out a sharply folded legal document. She held it up between her manicured fingers, letting it flutter slightly in the freezing night wind. She told me to step completely off her porch because I was officially trespassing on heavily protected private real estate property entirely. My voice shook with a mixture of profound grief and intense boiling rage as I told her she was completely insane and that this was my grandfather's house. Maya smiled a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach her dark, calculating eyes. She unfolded the crisp white paper and shoved it directly toward my face, tapping a specific line of text with her index finger. She proudly announced that it was a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney, granting Jason absolute total control over every single aspect of William's estate property and highly confidential personal financial business affairs forever. She claimed Grandpa had eagerly signed it just 2 days ago, realizing he needed successful, wealthy professionals to handle his complicated business, rather than an emotional, overworked accountant who clearly could not manage her own life. I stared at the document, completely horrified. The signature at the bottom was shaky and utterly wrong, but the heavy notary stamp pressed into the corner was undeniably real. She explicitly warned me that if I ever tried to interfere with their legal authority, she would personally ensure I was arrested. Maya smirked triumphantly and slammed the heavy wooden front door completely shut tonight. My morning started in an incredibly bleak reality. I woke up on the lumpy sofa of my tiny apartment, feeling completely numb and physically exhausted. My eyes were heavily swollen from crying entirely through the night, and my mind was spinning in agonizing, confusing circles. I had absolutely nothing. My clothes, my audit notebooks, my sense of security, they were all trapped behind a suburban door with a violently drilled-out lock. At exactly 8 in the morning, my cell phone buzzed loudly against the wooden coffee table. It was a sterile, incredibly brief text message from Jason demanding I meet him and Maya at noon. He designated a high-end artisan coffee shop right across the street from Maya's luxury real estate office in downtown Chicago. He claimed we needed to finalize the immediate legal logistics regarding the estate before the funeral home would proceed with any further arrangements. I dragged my exhausted body off the couch, washed my face with freezing cold water, and put on the only clean business suit I had managed to salvage from my car the night before. I drove downtown in a complete miserable daze. I genuinely thought we were going to discuss the burial costs, the floral arrangements, and the final resting place of the man who had unconditionally loved us. I thought despite their unbelievable cruelty the night before, that extreme grief would temporarily sober them into acting like decent human beings for just one single afternoon. I was so incredibly naive. When I walked into the bustling, overly bright coffee shop, the visual contrast between us was instantly sickening. I looked like a woman actively drowning in profound grief, with dark, heavy circles under my eyes and a pale, trembling face. Jason and Maya looked like they were preparing to close a massive corporate merger and celebrate a multi-million-dollar victory. Jason was wearing a sharp-tailored navy suit, looking completely relaxed as he leisurely sipped an expensive imported espresso. Maya sat beside him, radiating absolute pure arrogance in a stark white designer dress, her heavy diamond jewelry catching the bright sunlight pouring through the large glass windows. They did not stand up when I approached the table. They did not offer a single word of comfort or basic human sympathy. Maya simply gestured to the empty metal chair across from them with a perfectly manicured hand, holding a look of extreme boredom. I sat down, placing my purse on my lap, keeping my hands tightly folded together to hide how badly they were shaking. I asked them what specific funeral logistics we needed to discuss, hoping we could just focus on honoring Grandpa William. Jason completely ignored my emotional question. Instead, he reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick cream-colored manila folder. He slid it across the smooth marble table directly toward me. His face was entirely devoid of any brotherly affection or sadness. He looked at me with the cold, detached expression of a ruthless collections agent. He told me that they had spent the entire morning meeting with a private wealth attorney to establish the immediate legal hierarchy of the family assets. I opened the heavy folder with trembling fingers, completely unprepared for the absolute devastation waiting inside. Resting on top of the stack of legal forms was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. It was a handwritten will. My eyes scanned the messy, scrawled ink, and my heart completely dropped into the deepest, dark pit of my stomach. The document claimed to be the final testament of William Harper executed just days before his sudden, massive heart attack. The words on the page were utterly crushing and deeply offensive. The letter explicitly stated that Grandpa William was leaving 100% of his entire estate, his property, his bank accounts, his personal belongings, and all undisclosed financial trusts entirely and solely to his grandson Jason. The document boldly claimed that Jason was the true rightful head of the family and the only one capable of managing the heavy burden of a financial legacy. But the absolute most painful part was the single vicious sentence directed at me. It stated that because I was already a financially independent professional, I required no further assistance and was strictly excluded from inheriting a single dime. I sat there in the loud, crowded coffee shop, staring at the horrible blue ink, completely unable to breathe or speak. My vision blurred wildly as hot tears threatened to spill. For one agonizing, terrifying second, I actually believed it. I felt an intense, sickening wave of absolute rejection wash over my entire body. I questioned if my grandfather had secretly resented me, if my years of devoted caregiving had actually meant absolutely nothing to him. I wondered if he had truly preferred the flashy, successful grandson who completely ignored him over the quiet, dedicated granddaughter who cooked his meals and sorted his daily medications. Maya leaned forward, resting her elbows aggressively on the marble table, invading my personal space. She watched my face crumble with an expression of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. She let out a soft, condescending sigh and told me she knew this must be incredibly hard for me to read. She claimed in a sickly, sweet, patronizing tone that Grandpa had simply realized the undeniable truth in his final days. She said he finally understood that Jason was a powerful businessman who could handle massive wealth, while I was just a tired, emotionally unstable auditor who would likely squander the money or let it sit uselessly in a checking account. Jason sat back in his chair, puffing out his chest, nodding in profound, arrogant agreement with her vicious, cruel words. He had the absolute audacity to look me dead in the eye and say that Grandpa wanted the family name to mean something in the elite business world, and only he could make that happen. They were stripping away my entire history with the man who raised me, erasing my love and devotion and rewriting the narrative to make themselves the absolute rightful heroes of the story. Then Maya reached into the folder again and pulled out a second document. This one was professionally typed, highly official, and filled with dense, intimidating legal jargon. She placed it perfectly parallel to the edge of the table and set a heavy, expensive gold pen right on top of it. She leaned in, even closer, her expensive, heavy perfume completely suffocating the air around me. She told me that she and Jason were not entirely heartless monsters. She said they recognized that I had spent a lot of my personal time driving out to the suburbs to act as an unpaid maid and nurse for the old man. She actually used the degrading word, maid. She explained that the document on the table was a comprehensive, binding legal waiver. If I signed my name at the bottom, permanently forfeiting my absolute right to ever contest the handwritten will in any court of law, they would write me a personal check for exactly $50,000 right here and now. She called it a generous pity check. She told me I could use the money to pay off my boring student loans or upgrade my pathetic, reliable car. Jason chimed in confidently, stating that $50,000 was far more than fair compensation for the cheap grocery runs and the homemade soups I had provided over the years. They were actively trying to put a devastatingly low price tag on my unconditional love. They wanted me to sign away my voice, my rights, and my dignity for a tiny fraction of what they believed they had just successfully stolen. Maya crossed her arms, waiting for me to eagerly grab the gold pen. She had completely miscalculated who she was dealing with. She thought the large sum of immediate cash would easily blind a struggling young auditor. She thought my profound grief would make me desperate and entirely compliant. But as I stared down at that handwritten will, my sorrow began to burn away, rapidly replaced by the sharp, cold, analytical instincts I used every single day in the corporate financial world. I am a highly trained auditor. My entire career is built on verifying authenticity, detecting microscopic financial anomalies, and identifying blatant corporate fraud. I stopped looking at the emotional words on the page and started looking at the physical ink on the paper. I had balanced my grandfather's checkbook every single Friday evening for the last 5 years. I knew the exact slope of his cursive, the specific heavy pressure he applied to the paper, and the slight leftward lean of his capital letters. The signature at the bottom of this supposed will was completely entirely wrong. The ink flow was far too smooth, lacking the characteristic shaky pauses of an elderly man with severe arthritis in his knuckles. The letters were formed too perfectly, and the pen pressure was completely uniform, indicating a firm, confident hand rather than a frail, declining one. The looping stroke on the capital W in William was entirely foreign to his actual handwriting. A massive electric shock of pure realization hit my brain. The document was a complete amateur forgery. Grandpa William had never written those horrible rejecting words. He had never excluded me from his life or his legacy. Jason and Maya had completely fabricated the entire document to orchestrate a massive, illegal, hostile takeover of the $20 million blind trust they had secretly discovered. The $50,000 pity check was not a generous gift for my caregiving services. It was an incredibly cheap, dirty bribe, designed to legally silence the only person who could possibly expose their massive criminal conspiracy. They were trying to buy my permanent silence before I could ever hire an attorney and demand a formal forensic handwriting analysis. My breathing steadied perfectly. The intense, crushing weight of the grief lifted completely off my chest, replaced by a fiery, unstoppable sense of absolute purpose. I did not scream at them. I did not cry or throw the expensive coffee in their smug faces. I simply picked up the heavy gold pen, rolled it slowly between my fingers, and then placed it firmly back onto the table, completely untouched. I looked directly into Maya's arrogant, calculating eyes, and then shifted my gaze to my cowardly, trembling brother. I told them very calmly and very clearly that I would absolutely never sign their pathetic, fraudulent document. I told them they could take their $50,000 bribe and burn it. Maya's smug, confident smile instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp flash of genuine panic. Jason sat up straight, his face turning bright red as he angrily demanded, "I stop being so stubborn and selfish." I stood up from the table, grabbed my purse, and looked down at them with absolute, unwavering disgust. I told them they had deeply underestimated me for the very last time. I turned around and walked straight out of the coffee shop, leaving the forged will and the unsigned waiver sitting right on the table, knowing exactly what I had to do next. I walked out of that high-end coffee shop with my heart hammering against my ribs, but my mind was completely clear. I had taken the photocopy of the handwritten will they provided in the folder, folding it sharply and slipping it into my purse before I stood up. I drove straight back to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and spread the document out flat on my kitchen counter under the bright overhead lights. I am a financial auditor. My entire professional life is dedicated to uncovering discrepancies that people try desperately to hide. I spend 60 hours a week analyzing signatures, verifying authorizations, and tracing fraudulent paper trails down to the microscopic level. Jason and Maya thought they were dealing with a grieving, heartbroken little sister who would be too blinded by tears to look closely at the details. They were catastrophically wrong. I leaned over the kitchen island and stared at the blue ink on the page. I did not cry. Crying was a luxury I could no longer afford. I needed to work. I had balanced Grandpa William's checkbook every single Friday evening for the past 5 years. I knew his handwriting better than I knew my own. His cursive was heavily marked by the severe arthritis that had crippled his hands over decades of hard physical labor. When Grandpa wrote his name, his pen would stutter and drag, creating tiny pools of ink where he had to pause and gather the strength to complete the next letter. The baseline of his signature always drifted slightly downward because his wrist could not comfortably hold the horizontal line. But the signature staring back at me on this so-called final testament was entirely wrong. It was flawlessly fluid. The loops on the capital W were perfectly executed with a swift, confident motion. There were absolutely no ink pools, no hesitations, and no downward drift. The pen pressure was entirely uniform, indicating a strong, steady hand gripping the barrel of the pen tightly and moving it with absolute, deliberate speed. Furthermore, the document claimed to have been signed just hours before he suffered a massive catastrophic heart attack. A man in the active stages of severe heart failure, struggling to draw oxygen into his lungs, does not suddenly regain the fine motor control of a healthy 30-year-old man. The document was an amateur forgery, and it was painfully obvious to anyone who actually cared enough to look. But proving it in a court of law against a high-powered real estate director and a brother willing to lie under oath would require far more than just my professional opinion. I needed undeniable, concrete proof. I needed to show exactly how that piece of paper came into existence. And suddenly a memory struck me with the force of a physical blow. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the forged signature. 8 months ago, Grandpa William had been struggling terribly with sleep apnea and severe nighttime coughing fits. He refused to move into an assisted living facility, and I was absolutely terrified of him stopping breathing while I was stuck working late at the accounting firm. To give myself peace of mind, I had purchased a high-end medical-grade air purifier for his bedroom. But what nobody else knew, not Jason, not Maya, and not even Grandpa, was that I had secretly modified the device. I had carefully installed a tiny motion-activated nanny camera perfectly hidden behind the dark plastic ventilation grill. It was positioned in the corner of his small bedroom, giving a completely unobstructed, wide-angle view of his bed, his nightstand, and the entire surrounding area. I had set it up to record directly onto a high-capacity, hidden SD card, so I could discreetly review his nighttime breathing patterns if he ever complained of exhaustion. Jason and Maya never bothered to visit, so they had absolutely no idea the device even existed. And when Jason hired that locksmith to drill out the front door lock in his frantic rush to secure the house, they had carelessly left the air purifier plugged right into the wall. I looked at the digital clock on my microwave. It was currently 1 a.m. The suburban neighborhood would be completely dead and silent. I grabbed my car keys, a small flashlight, and dressed entirely in dark clothes. My heart was racing so fast, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I drove the familiar 40-minute route out to the suburbs, keeping my speed perfectly exact to avoid any unnecessary attention. When I reached his street, I did not pull into his driveway. Maya's pristine white luxury SUV was thankfully gone, but I could not risk anyone spotting my car and calling my brother. I parked 3 blocks away in the shadows of a large oak tree and walked the rest of the distance on foot. The freezing winter wind bit through my jacket, but I barely felt the cold. The adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me entirely hyper-focused. I approached his property from the back alley, slipping quietly through the rusted chain-link gate that enclosed his overgrown backyard. Jason had drilled out the heavy brass lock on the front porch, but he knew absolutely nothing about the old wooden mudroom door, hidden behind the overgrown rhododendron bushes in the back. Years ago, the latch had rusted completely shut, and Grandpa had simply left it alone. But I had quietly hired a handyman to fix and replace that specific deadbolt just in case I ever needed emergency access to the kitchen. I slipped the heavy brass key into the lock, turned it slowly, and heard the satisfying, heavy click of the deadbolt sliding back. I pushed the wooden door open and stepped into the pitch-black kitchen. The house smelled exactly like him, stale peppermint old paper and the faint lingering scent of the lavender soap I used to wash his sheets. A massive wave of fresh grief threatened to crash over me, but I aggressively forced it down. This was not the time to mourn. This was the time to gather ammunition. I moved through the dark, silent house, navigating entirely by memory without ever turning on my flashlight. I knew exactly which floorboards squeaked, and I carefully stepped over them, creeping silently down the narrow hallway toward his bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just the way the paramedics had left it. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room felt incredibly cold and empty. The bed was unmade, the blankets tossed aside in the frantic, tragic final moments of his life. I forced my eyes away from the bed and looked straight toward the far corner of the room. The sleek black air purifier was still sitting right there on the small wooden dresser, completely undisturbed. Its small green power light was glowing softly in the darkness, indicating it was still actively drawing power from the wall outlet. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to grip the edge of the dresser to steady myself. I reached around the back of the plastic casing, pressing my fingernail into the tiny hidden latch I had carved out months ago. The plastic panel popped off with a soft click. I shined my small flashlight into the narrow opening and saw the tiny black square of the SD card resting perfectly in its slot. I pressed it gently, and the spring-loaded mechanism ejected the card into my waiting palm. I clutched that tiny piece of plastic in my fist, like it was the most valuable diamond on Earth. I quickly snapped the plastic cover back onto the air purifier, ensuring it looked entirely untouched. I did not linger a single second longer than necessary. I silently retraced my steps through the dark hallway out the kitchen door and locked the heavy deadbolt firmly behind me. I walked rapidly through the freezing neighborhood, back to my parked car, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. I locked my car doors, started the engine, and drove straight back to downtown Chicago without playing the radio or turning on the heater. The silence in my car was absolutely deafening. By the time I returned to my apartment and locked the deadbolt, it was nearly 3 in the morning. I did not bother taking off my coat. I walked straight to my desk, opened my laptop, and slid the tiny SD card into the side port. My hands were trembling so uncontrollably that it took me 3 attempts to click on the correct file folder. The video files were meticulously organized by date and timestamps, thanks to the motion activation software. I scrolled rapidly past months of mundane footage, Grandpa reading his newspaper, drinking his tea, tossing and turning in his sleep. I scrolled all the way down to the exact date of his death. There were several dozen short video clips from that specific, horrible day. I clicked on the first file from the late afternoon, just hours before his heart finally gave out. The video player opened on my screen and I pressed play. The high-definition night vision camera instantly illuminated the room in sharp monochrome gray and white. I saw Grandpa William lying heavily in his bed. He looked incredibly frail, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. He was clearly drifting in and out of consciousness, deeply exhausted and completely vulnerable. Suddenly, the heavy wooden bedroom door swung open. The motion sensor immediately began recording in full color as the hallway light flooded into the dark room. Maya walked in first. She was wearing a sharp designer business suit, her hair perfectly smoothed back, looking entirely out of place in the humble, dusty bedroom. Following right behind her was a tall, heavy-set man wearing a cheap gray suit and carrying a dark leather briefcase. He looked incredibly nervous, constantly wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. And then, Jason walked into the frame. My own brother. He was holding a stack of papers and a small square object that looked exactly like a black ink pad. I sat completely frozen in my desk chair, unable to drag my eyes away from the glowing screen. The audio on the nanny camera was crystal clear, picking up every single horrific whisper. I heard Maya sharply instruct the nervous man to stand near the door and keep watch. She called him by his first name, confirming he was the corrupt notary they had somehow bribed or blackmailed into this disgusting scheme. Jason approached the side of the bed. He leaned over our grandfather, the man who had worked his hands to the bone to feed us when we were starving children. Jason did not stroke his forehead or offer him a sip of water. Instead, he spoke to Maya in a rushed, panicked whisper, complaining that the old man was completely unresponsive and could not physically hold the pen. Maya stepped up to the opposite side of the bed, looking down at Grandpa with absolute cold indifference. I watched in pure, unadulterated horror as she calmly told Jason to just use the ink pad and stamp his thumbprint on the bottom of the page next to the forged signature. She actually said it did not matter if he was awake, because dead men cannot testify in court. The sheer level of calculated psychopathic cruelty radiating from the screen made me physically nauseous. I watched my brother, the boy I had grown up with, reach down and aggressively grab Grandpa's limp, frail hand. Grandpa shifted slightly, letting out a soft, pained groan as Jason roughly pulled his arm out from under the heavy blankets. Jason pressed Grandpa's thumb firmly into the black ink pad, leaving a dark stain on his fragile skin. Then Jason placed the forged handwritten will flat against the hard surface of the nightstand. With Maya watching closely like a predatory bird, Jason forcefully pressed our grandfather's inked thumb directly onto the bottom of the fraudulent document, exactly next to where they had already forged his cursive signature. The corrupt notary standing by the door quickly stamped his official seal on the paper, securing the massive illegal lie. They did all of this while Grandpa was actively dying in front of them, completely unaware that his own family was robbing him blind in his final vulnerable hours on Earth. Maya quickly snatched the document off the nightstand, waving it in the air to dry the ink. She whispered to Jason that they finally had everything they needed and that the $20 million was officially secured. They did not even bother to tuck Grandpa's arm back under the warm blankets. They simply turned around and walked out of the bedroom, shutting the door firmly behind them and plunging the room back into total darkness. The video clip ended and the screen faded to black, leaving me staring at my own pale reflection in the glossy monitor. I sat there in the absolute silence of my apartment, processing the horrifying magnitude of the crime I had just witnessed. They had not just forged a document, they had actively conspired to commit severe felony elder abuse, massive financial fraud, and coordinated grand larceny. They had violated the basic sacred trust of family in the most disgusting, unforgivable way imaginable. The $50,000 bribe they offered me earlier that day suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. They were completely terrified. They knew that if anyone ever challenged the validity of that document, their entire carefully constructed high society lives would instantly shatter into a million pieces. They thought they had committed the perfect, flawless crime. They thought the only witness to their horrific actions was a dying old man who could never speak out against them. They had absolutely no idea that every single second of their treacherous conspiracy was now securely saved on a hard drive sitting on my desk in downtown Chicago. The intense, profound sadness that had completely consumed me over the past few days evaporated in an instant. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my heart, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had transformed completely into something incredibly sharp, dangerous, and unstoppable. I slowly reached out and popped the SD card out of the computer, carefully placing it into a small plastic protective case. I was not a scared, grieving little sister anymore. I was a professional auditor, armed with undeniable forensic evidence and a video recording that would absolutely destroy their entire world. I did not shed a single tear as I began drafting a highly detailed chronological timeline of their actions. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to find Grandpa's real attorney, and I needed to set a trap so devastating, so perfectly inescapable, that Jason and Maya would never see it coming until the handcuffs were actively clicking around their wrists. I walked into my accounting firm the following morning, running on absolutely zero sleep and fueled entirely by black coffee and sheer adrenaline. The heavy glass doors of the lobby usually felt like a symbol of my hard-earned corporate stability, but today they felt like the entrance to an active war zone. Jason and Maya knew I had walked away from their $50,000 bribe. They knew I had left the forged documents and the legal waiver sitting completely untouched on that marble coffee shop table. Maya is a woman who treats any form of rejection as a personal declaration of war. I knew she would retaliate against me, but I drastically underestimated how incredibly fast and how ruthlessly she would strike. By 10 in the morning, my desk phone rang loudly. It was the managing partner of my firm, Mr. Sterling, calling me directly into his corner office. That never happened unless a massive corporate account was in serious jeopardy. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, gripping my clipboard tightly, while my stomach twisted into heavy, painful knots. When I opened his thick oak door, I immediately noticed the extreme tension in his rigid posture. He was standing by his large window overlooking the Chicago skyline, holding a printed email in his hands. He did not offer me a seat. He looked at me with a cold, deeply disappointed expression and bluntly asked me if there was a personal situation interfering with my professional judgment. I was completely caught off guard. I carefully asked him what he meant by that statement. He explained that he had just received a highly disturbing phone call from the executive board of Maya's luxury real estate conglomerate. They were one of our accounting firm's most lucrative prospective clients, and Maya held significant influence over their vendor contracts. Maya had personally contacted the senior partners and falsely claimed that I was undergoing a severe mental breakdown due to the recent grief of losing my grandfather. She told my boss that I was behaving erratically, making wild, terrifying accusations against my own family, and exhibiting signs of extreme financial desperation. She strongly suggested that keeping me on their accounts would be a massive liability to their firm, and she subtly threatened to pull their entire multi-million-dollar contract if I was not immediately suspended, pending a thorough psychological evaluation. I stood there in that freezing air-conditioned office, feeling the floor completely drop out from under my feet. Maya was actively trying to destroy my entire career, to cut off my only source of independent income, and completely discredit me before I could ever show that hidden camera footage to a judge. She wanted to paint a public picture of me as a crazy, greedy sister, so that any legal allegations I made against her would look like the desperate, pathetic lies of a mentally unstable woman. My boss told me I was being placed on immediate unpaid administrative leave, effective right that very second. He demanded I hand over my corporate access badge and told me to clear out my personal desk. I tried desperately to defend myself. I tried to explain that it was a malicious, targeted lie, orchestrated by a hostile family member trying to cover up a crime, but he simply held up his hand to silence my words. In the ruthless corporate world, money always speaks far louder than the truth. Maya represented a massive financial commission for the partners, and I was just an expendable mid-level employee. I was escorted out of the building by a silent security guard, carrying a cardboard box filled with my desk items, while my coworkers stared at me in absolute shock. I had worked 60-hour weeks for 5 years to build a flawless professional reputation, and Maya had completely dismantled it with one single calculated phone call. I sat in my car in the dark parking garage, completely paralyzed by the sheer speed of her vicious attack. My breathing was ragged, and my hands shook violently as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. I thought the worst of their retaliation was over, but my phone suddenly started vibrating aggressively in the center console. It buzzed once, then twice, then 10 times in rapid, terrifying succession. I picked it up and saw a massive flood of text notifications pouring onto my locked screen. They were not from my concerned coworkers. They were from my extended family. Aunts, uncles, and older cousins who had not spoken to me in several years were suddenly flooding my inbox with paragraphs of pure, unadulterated hatred. My hands trembled as I unlocked my phone and opened the family group chat to see what was happening. Jason had intentionally escalated the war from the corporate boardroom directly into the public social sphere. He had just published a massive, incredibly dramatic post on Facebook, tagging every single member of our extended family to ensure maximum visibility. I opened the application and the incredibly long post filled my entire screen. The absolute cruelty of his words literally made me gasp for air in the quiet isolation of my parked car. Jason had written a completely fabricated, heart-wrenching essay portraying himself as the devoted, grieving grandson, trying desperately to hold the broken family together after Grandpa William passed away. He painted an elaborate, horrifying picture, claiming that while he and Maya were busy organizing the funeral and paying for all the expensive burial arrangements out of their own pockets, I had been secretly draining Grandpa's modest savings accounts to fund my lavish city lifestyle. He lied effortlessly, telling everyone that I had financially manipulated a sick, vulnerable old man into giving me his debit cards so I could buy expensive clothes and pay my expensive downtown rent. But the most malicious, sickening part of his entire post was the grand finale. Jason claimed that out of pure Christian forgiveness, he and Maya had offered me $50,000 from their own personal savings to help me get back on my feet and seek professional therapy. He told the entire internet that I had spit in their faces, demanded even more money, and stormed out threatening to destroy their hard-earned reputations if they did not pay me off immediately. He completely inverted the truth with terrifying ease. He took their heinous crimes, their forgery, their disgusting bribe, and their total abandonment of our grandfather, and masterfully pinned every single ounce of the blame directly onto my shoulders. He played the role of the wounded, generous victim with absolute terrifying perfection. The comment section under his post was an absolute bloodbath of misplaced family loyalty and toxic blind outrage. People who had completely ignored Grandpa William for a decade were suddenly deeply outraged on his behalf because it gave them a reason to feel morally superior. My Aunt Linda wrote that she always knew I was a greedy, selfish brat who never truly cared about traditional family values. My cousin David commented that I was a complete disgrace to the family name and that I deserved to be entirely cut off from everyone and left to rot. The direct text messages hitting my phone were even worse than the public comments. They were incredibly vicious, deeply personal attacks designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Relatives told me I was a monster, a thief, and a complete embarrassment to the memory of our grandfather. My phone buzzed again, and it was a direct private message from Jason himself. It was not a long paragraph defending his actions. It was just one single, chilling sentence. He told me that nobody would ever believe a desperate, unemployed thief over a highly successful, respected family man. He was establishing absolute, total dominance. He wanted me to know that he controlled the public narrative, he controlled my corporate career, and he controlled the entire extended family. He was actively trying to crush my spirit so completely that I would be entirely too terrified and too broken to ever step foot inside a courtroom or hire an attorney to fight back. I drove back to my small, quiet apartment, feeling entirely suffocated by the heavy, crushing weight of their highly coordinated attack. I locked the deadbolt, slid down the solid wood of the front door, and sat on the floor of my narrow entryway, pulling my knees tightly against my chest. The silence of my apartment felt incredibly heavy and deeply oppressive. I had never felt so profoundly entirely alone in my entire 32 years of existence. My grandfather, the only person who had ever truly loved and protected me, was dead and buried. My accounting career, the professional stability I had sacrificed my entire 20s to build, was completely gone, suspended indefinitely by a single malicious lie. My entire extended family deeply believed I was a manipulative, thieving monster who abused an elderly man for cash. I was completely boxed into a dark, suffocating corner by two people who possessed zero moral boundaries and wielded endless social power. The extreme psychological pressure they were actively applying was explicitly designed to make me surrender completely. I sat on that cold entryway floor while my cell phone continued to light up with fresh, hateful messages from people sharing my bloodline. The natural human response to such overwhelming, massive isolation is to simply give up the fight. It is incredibly easy to just wave a white flag sign, whatever fraudulent legal document they put in front of you, and accept the tiny scrap of money they throw on the floor, just to make the horrific public humiliation finally stop. I knew exactly what they were waiting for. They were waiting for my spirit to completely shatter under the intense weight of the isolation. They were waiting for me to call them back, crying and begging for their forgiveness and pleading for that $50,000 check so I could survive without my job. They wanted me to submit to their false reality. I looked across my small living room and my eyes landed on a simple framed photograph sitting on my modest wooden bookshelf. It was a picture of Grandpa William and me, taken during my college graduation years ago. He was wearing his best faded flannel shirt, smiling with absolute pure pride, his worn, calloused hand resting gently on my shoulder. I remembered the incredibly long, grueling evening commutes in heavy rain and snow traffic, just to make sure he ate a warm, healthy meal. I remembered balancing his checkbook at his kitchen table and watching him struggle to form letters with his severely arthritic hands. I remembered the horrifying, chilling video footage currently saved securely on my laptop, showing Jason and Maya treating his unconscious, vulnerable body like a mere prop in their disgusting criminal enterprise. The tears that had been threatening to fall all day finally dried up completely. The crushing, suffocating grief and the intense, terrifying panic melted away, leaving behind something incredibly cold and sharp and unbreakable inside my chest. They had successfully destroyed my current reputation and temporarily ruined my career. They had successfully convinced the entire extended family that I was a greedy villain who deserved nothing but contempt. But they had made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation in their arrogant, frantic rush to secure the $20 million blind trust. They deeply believed that isolating me and stripping me of my support system would make me weak and compliant. They did not realize that stripping away everything I had to lose also stripped away every single reason I had to hold back or play by their rules. I was no longer a devoted, polite granddaughter trying to keep the fragile peace in a toxic, broken family. I was a cornered auditor with absolute definitive proof of major felony fraud, and I had absolutely nothing left to lose in this world. I slowly stood up from the floor, leaving my phone buzzing with their hateful lies, and walked directly to my desk. I opened my laptop and stared at the digital file containing the hidden nanny camera footage. I did not cry, and I did not panic. I simply got to work planning the absolute destruction of everything they had built. I sat alone in the quiet, dim light of my small apartment, staring at the blank wall for what felt like hours after Jason launched his vicious public smear campaign. My phone had finally stopped vibrating with hateful messages from extended family members who had entirely bought into his carefully fabricated lies. The total isolation they had engineered was meant to break me completely and force me into absolute submission. But as the profound shock slowly wore off, a deep, burning clarity took over my mind. They thought they had backed a helpless, grieving girl into a completely inescapable corner. They forgot that they had cornered a highly trained corporate auditor with a meticulous mind for numbers and a complete refusal to surrender. I knew the incredibly crude handwritten will Jason and Maya had shoved in my face at the coffee shop was an absolute amateur forgery. I knew the notary stamp was corrupt, and I had the hidden camera footage securely saved on a flash drive to definitively prove they had physically forced our unconscious grandfather to put his thumbprint on that fraudulent paper. But exposing a forgery was only half the battle. If I wanted to entirely dismantle their false narrative and secure my grandfather's true legacy, I needed to find the actual legal truth. I needed to find the real documents. I walked over to the small storage closet in my hallway and pulled out 3 heavy reinforced cardboard boxes. Over the past 5 years of serving as Grandpa William's devoted caregiver, I had completely taken over his mundane bookkeeping. I balanced his monthly checkbook, paid his modest utility bills, and filed his simple tax returns. I had always kept copies of every single receipt and financial statement neatly organized in these boxes, just in case he ever faced an unexpected audit. I dragged the heavy boxes into my small kitchen and heaved them onto the counter. I brewed a massive pot of dark black coffee and aggressively rolled up my sleeves. Jason and Maya were incredibly arrogant and flashy, but they were fundamentally lazy. They had only discovered the $20 million blind trust because Jason accidentally intercepted a stray piece of mail. They did not know the deep, intricate financial history of the man they were actively trying to rob. They did not have his real contacts or his actual legal counsel. But I had a 10-year paper trail sitting right in front of me. I began meticulously sifting through thousands of faded store receipts, water bills, property tax notices, and ancient bank statements. I worked in absolute silence for 6 straight hours, tracing every single dollar that had ever legally flowed into or out of his checking account. I was looking for a very specific anomaly. If Grandpa William truly held over $20 million in a complex blind trust generated from highly lucrative early commercial real estate investments, he absolutely had to have a top-tier legal professional quietly managing the heavy corporate logistics behind the scenes. He would never rely on a generic local lawyer for that level of intense wealth preservation. At around 4 a.m, my eyes were burning from exhaustion, but my index finger suddenly stopped on a faded yellow bank statement from exactly 7 years ago. I pulled the delicate paper closer to the bright overhead light. Tucked quietly among the tiny charges for local groceries and cheap pharmacy co-payments was a significant recurring quarterly transfer. It was a completely discreet scheduled retainer fee, paid out exactly 4 times a year like absolute clockwork. The transfer did not go to a massive, flashy, downtown law firm. It went to a small, highly exclusive boutique private wealth management firm located in an old money historic district of the city. The specific authorized recipient attached to the routing number was simply listed as Jessica Monroe, attorney at law. A massive wave of pure electric hope shot straight down my spine. This was the exact hidden thread I had been desperately searching for. This was the silent guardian Grandpa had trusted with his true legacy, while he lived his humble, quiet life in the suburbs. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I showered dressed in my sharpest professional suit and drove directly to the historic district the very minute the morning sun broke over the Chicago skyline. The office of Jessica Monroe was absolutely nothing like the aggressively modern glass and steel corporate skyscrapers where Maya conducted her ruthless real estate deals. It was located inside a beautifully preserved vintage brownstone building surrounded by ancient oak trees and wrought iron fencing. There were no flashy neon signs or arrogant corporate logos. It completely radiated quiet generational wealth and absolute impenetrable discretion. I walked up the stone steps, holding my leather briefcase tightly against my side, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. When I stepped through the heavy, solid oak doors, the atmosphere was incredibly calm and hushed. The receptionist sitting behind a polished mahogany desk looked up and offered a warm, polite smile. I approached the desk and stated my name clearly, telling her that I desperately needed to speak with Jessica Monroe regarding the estate of William Harper. The receptionist did not ask me if I had a scheduled appointment. She simply typed a few quick keystrokes into her computer and nodded softly. She told me that Miss Monroe had actually been expecting me. That specific sentence made my breath catch in my throat. I was immediately guided down a quiet hallway lined with original oil paintings and ushered into a stunning, expansive corner office. Sitting behind a massive vintage desk was Jessica Monroe. She was a striking, formidable woman, likely in her late 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit with silver hair elegantly styled back. She possessed the kind of intense, deeply intelligent gaze that immediately commanded absolute respect in any room she entered. She stood up smoothly and extended her hand to me. When her firm handshake met mine, I saw genuine, profound sorrow in her dark eyes. She told me she was incredibly heartbroken to hear about William's sudden passing. She gestured for me to sit in one of the plush leather chairs opposite her desk. I sat down and opened my briefcase, pulling out a certified copy of the death certificate. I took a deep breath and began to explain the entire horrific nightmare I had been enduring over the past few days. I told her about the violent drilling of the locks on Grandpa's house, my belongings being tossed onto the freezing porch in garbage bags, and the massive public smear campaign Jason had launched on the internet to entirely destroy my professional reputation. Finally, I pulled out the photocopy of the crude handwritten will Jason and Maya had shoved across the coffee shop table. I placed it gently on the polished wood between us, explaining how they had offered me a $50,000 bribe to completely sign away my legal rights to an estate they claimed was now entirely theirs. Jessica Monroe did not gasp in shock. She did not look surprised or confused by any of the horrifying details I was revealing. Instead, she simply let out a long, heavy sigh and picked up the fraudulent photocopy with an expression of absolute profound disgust. She glanced at the forged signature and the black ink thumbprint at the bottom of the page and gently set it face down on her desk as if it was a piece of contaminated trash. She looked directly into my eyes, and her voice was incredibly calm and measured. She explicitly confirmed every single suspicion I had harbored. She told me that the handwritten document was not worth the cheap paper it was printed on. She formally verified that Grandpa William was indeed the sole owner of a massive, incredibly complex, blind trust currently valued at well over $20 million. She explained that he had amassed this fortune decades ago through brilliant, perfectly timed commercial real estate investments, acquiring highly valuable downtown properties long before the city expanded. She told me that William had purposely chosen to live in that tiny, decaying suburban house because he possessed a deep, fundamental distrust of flashy, modern wealth. He believed that sudden, massive fortunes inevitably corrupted weak moral character and destroyed family loyalty. He wanted to live simply, and he wanted to observe how the people in his life behaved when they believed there was absolutely no money to be gained from him. Hearing her validate the immense scale of his hidden wealth was staggering, but what she said next completely shifted the entire ground beneath my feet. I asked her why Grandpa had kept this massive secret for so long. I asked why he had never stepped in to financially assist me when I was struggling through college, or why he had never simply hired aggressive legal protection to stop Jason and Maya from treating him with such intense, cruel disrespect over the years. Jessica leaned back in her heavy leather chair, folding her hands precisely on her desk. She looked at me with an expression of intense, profound respect. She told me that I needed to completely understand just how incredibly brilliant and highly observant my grandfather truly was. He was not a helpless, confused old man, being entirely ignored by the modern world. He was a silent, calculating patriarch, watching his family with an eagle eye. Jessica reached down and unlocked a heavy steel drawer on the bottom right side of her desk. She pulled out a thick, perfectly sealed legal dossier bearing the official gold crest of her firm. She placed it carefully in the center of the desk, right next to the ridiculous forged document Jason had created. She rested her hand flat on the heavy dossier and revealed a truth so completely stunning, it actually made my eyes well up with fresh, immediate tears. She told me that Grandpa William knew exactly who Jason and Maya truly were. He had known for a very long time. He saw the intense, shallow greed festering in my brother's soul, and he recognized the absolute ruthless, predatory nature of Maya's entire personality. He knew they were desperately obsessed with projecting an image of elite corporate wealth, and he knew they completely despised him because he did not fit into their glamorous, curated aesthetic. He intentionally let them ignore him. He purposely let them treat him poorly because it provided him with the absolute, unvarnished truth of their deeply toxic character. But more importantly, Jessica continued, her voice softening with genuine emotion. He knew exactly who you were. He watched you commute 40 minutes in the freezing rain after working grueling 10-hour audit shifts just to cook his dinners and sort his medications. He watched you protect him, love him, and ask for absolutely nothing in return. Jessica tapped the heavy sealed dossier with her index finger. She explained that Grandpa had explicitly anticipated this exact horrific betrayal. He knew that the very second his heart stopped beating, Jason and Maya would completely drop their act and violently swoop in like starving vultures to seize control of whatever small assets they assumed he possessed. He knew they would try to aggressively push me out of the picture because my genuine love for him posed a massive threat to their total, absolute control. He had spent the last 5 years working directly with Jessica to meticulously construct a completely impenetrable, airtight legal fortress around his $20 million legacy. He had specifically engineered a highly complex estate plan designed not just to legally protect the money, but to completely, permanently trap Jason and Maya in their own unbelievable greed. He had intentionally left tiny, subtle breadcrumbs, an obscure tax document here, a vaguely worded piece of mail there, hoping Jason's arrogant snooping would eventually lead him to intercept something that hinted at the massive blind trust. Grandpa had actively set a trap, knowing that if Jason ever caught a small whiff of the true wealth, his extreme corporate greed would instantly drive him to commit desperate illegal acts to secure it. Grandpa wanted them to willingly expose their absolute worst, most criminal behavior on the permanent legal record before the true will was ever revealed. Jessica looked at me with a sharp, determined smile that completely mirrored my own internal fire. She told me that Grandpa had intentionally armed the trap, but he had explicitly chosen me to be the one to finally trigger it. He knew my professional auditor instincts would completely reject their blatant forgery, and he knew I was strong enough to withstand their vicious psychological smear campaigns. He trusted me to walk into this office and discover the truth. I sat in that quiet, elegant room, completely overwhelmed by the profound depth of his unconditional love and his strategic, absolute brilliance. My grandfather had protected me from the grave, ensuring that the very people who thought they were destroying my life were actually walking blindly into an inescapable, devastating legal nightmare. The entire corporate war they thought they were winning had actually been completely orchestrated by the man they discarded as worthless. And now with Jessica Monroe sitting across from me, I finally had the absolute ultimate power to spring the trap and burn their perfectly curated wealthy lives completely to the ground. I walked out of Jessica Monroe's office and stepped back into the freezing Chicago wind, feeling like an entirely different human being. The heavy iron weight that had been crushing my chest for the last week was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, cold, absolute clarity. Grandpa William had known exactly what he was doing. He had trusted me to see through the lies, and he had armed me with the ultimate weapon to destroy their treacherous greed. But as I sat in my freezing car, gripping the steering wheel, I realized that springing the trap prematurely would be a catastrophic mistake. Jason and Maya were highly aggressive corporate predators. If I marched into a courtroom right now and aggressively screamed about the forged will and the hidden camera footage, they would instantly activate their high-priced lawyers. They would spin the narrative, stall the legal process, and bury me in endless, exhausting litigation. I needed them to walk willingly into the slaughterhouse. I needed them to be so completely blinded by their own towering arrogance that they would never, ever see the execution coming until the blade had already dropped. The absolute best way to catch a predator is to completely convince them that their prey is already dead. I needed to pretend that their vicious social media smear campaign and their calculated attack on my accounting career had completely shattered my spirit. I needed to show them the exact pathetic, broken little sister they desperately wanted to see. I drove back to my tiny apartment, locked the door, and sat on my faded sofa. I pulled out my cell phone and stared at the dark screen for a very long time. My hands hovered over the digital keyboard as I carefully mentally crafted the most agonizingly humiliating text message of my entire life. I had to swallow every single ounce of my immense pride and channel the pure desperation of a woman who had just lost absolutely everything. I began typing the message to Jason, intentionally letting my grammar slip and using desperate pleading language. I told him that I was completely ruined. I confessed that my accounting firm had officially fired me because of Maya's phone call, and that I had absolutely zero income to pay my upcoming rent. I typed out words that made me physically sick to my stomach. I apologized for being so emotional and stubborn at the coffee shop. I begged him to forgive my dramatic outburst. I told him that I was completely terrified of being homeless and that I desperately critically needed that $50,000 pity check just to survive the winter. I explicitly stated that I was ready to wave the white flag. I promised I would attend the formal will reading, sit quietly in the corner, and sign the permanent legal waiver forfeiting my absolute right to ever contest his forged document. I hit send before I could vomit and tossed the phone onto the coffee table. The agonizing wait only lasted 14 minutes. My phone buzzed loudly, shattering the tense silence of my apartment. It was a reply from Jason. It was not a long brotherly message of comfort. It was a short, brutally cold confirmation of his absolute victory. He told me he was glad I finally decided to stop acting like a psychotic burden and face reality. He confirmed the time and location of the formal will reading at Maya's elite corporate attorney's office. He finished the text by telling me to show up early and to not embarrass him in front of the legal partners. He had completely taken the bait. He genuinely believed he had crushed me into total, absolute submission. I thought I had mentally prepared myself for the absolute bottomless depths of their cruelty, but Maya always found a way to dig entirely new trenches of malice. 2 days later, exactly 24 hours before the scheduled will reading, a heavy, sharp knock echoed through my apartment. I opened my front door to find a confused delivery driver holding a battered, crushed cardboard box. The return address boldly listed Maya's luxury downtown real estate firm. I carried the dirty box to my kitchen counter and sliced through the heavy packing tape with a kitchen knife. I pulled back the cardboard flaps, expecting to find dense, intimidating legal paperwork, or perhaps a heavily drafted non-disclosure agreement for me to review before the meeting. Instead, a profound sour smell instantly hit my nose. It smelled like mildew, ancient mothballs, and stale sweat. I reached into the box and pulled out a garment that was so unbelievably insulting, it actually made my jaw drop. It was a massive, shapeless, horribly stained dress that looked like it had been violently dragged out of the absolute bottom bin of a filthy discount thrift store. The fabric was a highly unappealing, sickly shade of mustard yellow, covered in faded brown floral patterns. The collar was frayed and unspooling, and a massive dark oil stain ran directly down the left side of the pleated skirt. It was at least 4 sizes too big for my frame. Sitting at the very bottom of the cardboard box was a crisp white piece of heavy designer cardstock bearing Maya's embossed gold monogram. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The note was written in her perfectly sweeping, elegant cursive. It contained exactly one single vicious sentence. Wear this so you perfectly match your pathetic bank account at the formal reading tomorrow. I stood in my small kitchen, gripping that incredibly cruel note so tightly, my knuckles turned pure white. The sheer, unadulterated venom in that gesture was absolutely breathtaking. She had actively gone out of her way, driven to a rundown neighborhood, and dug through dirty, discarded clothes, specifically to find the most humiliating, degrading garment possible, just to mentally torture a woman she already believed was completely broken and financially ruined. My initial instinct was pure, blinding, volcanic rage. I wanted to march out to the alley and throw that disgusting yellow dress directly into the nearest flaming dumpster. I wanted to burn it to absolute ashes. But as I stared at the dark oil stain on the skirt, the intense burning anger slowly dissolved into a freezing, absolute calm. Maya was handing me the ultimate perfect disguise. She wanted me to show up looking like a helpless, pathetic, impoverished failure. She wanted the elite corporate attorneys in that high-rise conference room to look at me with profound, immediate disgust and pity. She wanted to solidify the false narrative that I was a desperate, unstable beggar who absolutely needed their $50,000 charity to simply exist in the world. I looked at the dress and a slow, sharp smile crept across my face. I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would wear her disgusting, malicious insult as my absolute ultimate armor. I took the dress to my small bathroom and washed it in the sink with heavy detergent scrubbing the fabric until my hands were completely raw, trying desperately to remove the horrible, stale stench of mildew. I hung it over the shower curtain rod to dry, watching the water drip slowly onto the linoleum floor. The next morning, the day of the final will reading, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and put the dress on. It hung off my shoulders like a massive, deflated parachute. The mustard yellow fabric completely washed out my complexion, making me look sickly and pale. The brown floral patterns clashed violently with the dark oil stain on the hip. I did not brush my hair. I did not put on a single drop of makeup. I let the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes show completely. I looked absolutely horrific. I looked exactly like a woman who had been thoroughly crushed, beaten down, and entirely defeated by a highly superior corporate power. I stared at my pathetic reflection and silently thanked Maya for her unbelievable arrogance. She was so completely focused on humiliating my outward appearance that she completely failed to realize the absolute lethal danger lurking just beneath the surface. Hidden safely inside my modest, cracked leather purse, alongside my simple car keys and a cheap tube of lip balm, was the pristine high-definition flash drive containing the undeniable video evidence of her and my brother physically forcing a dying man to stamp his thumbprint onto a forged legal document. I walked out of my apartment wearing that horrific, oversized, stained dress, feeling an intense electric anticipation thrumming through my veins. Let them look at me and see a desperate, broken beggar. Let them smile their arrogant, smug smiles and pass their thick, fraudulent legal documents across the polished mahogany table. They were walking blindly into an absolute massacre, and they had themselves to blame. I was going to let them sit in that towering glass skyscraper, let them feel the absolute intoxicating rush of their stolen $20 million victory, and then I was going to burn their entire, glamorous, untouchable world to the ground. I gripped the steering wheel of my old reliable car and drove straight toward downtown Chicago, ready to finish this war once and for all. As I drove through this busy downtown Chicago streets toward the towering glass skyscraper that housed Maya and her luxury real estate firm, I felt an incredible sense of calm wash over my entire body. The stained mustard yellow thrift store dress hung off my frame exactly like a symbol of absolute defeat. To any random person walking down the sidewalk, I looked like a completely broken woman who had lost absolutely everything. But beneath that humiliating fabric, my mind was operating with the lethal precision of a highly trained financial auditor who was about to close the most important case of her entire life. Jason and Maya genuinely believed that the 48 hours leading up to this final will reading were spent with me. Weeping alone on my lumpy apartment sofa, completely paralyzed by grief and financial terror. They thought their vicious social media smear campaign had successfully isolated me from the entire world, making me perfectly vulnerable to their disgusting extortion. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy picking out expensive champagne to celebrate their stolen $20 million victory, I was sitting in a highly secured gray interrogation room at the downtown Chicago Police Department, meticulously building an airtight criminal case against them. Exactly 2 days ago, I walked into the Financial Crimes Division carrying my heavy leather briefcase. I had specifically requested a meeting with Detective Reynolds, a seasoned veteran who specialized in massive corporate fraud and elder financial abuse. I did not walk in completely hysterical or sobbing like a typical helpless victim. I walked in like an auditor presenting a thoroughly investigated corporate discrepancy. I sat down at the battered metal table across from the detective and carefully laid out the entire timeline. I started with the extensive, pristine financial records I had maintained for Grandpa William over the past 5 years. I showed him the precise natural deterioration of my grandfather's handwriting due to his severe arthritis and failing health. Then I placed the photocopy of the crude forged will Jason and Maya had shoved at me in the coffee shop directly next to it. Detective Reynolds leaned over the table, studying the documents with a deeply trained eye. He immediately noticed the completely flawless fluid ink flow on the forgery, instantly agreeing that it looked absolutely nothing like the authentic, shaky signatures of a dying 80-year-old man. But a suspicious signature alone was not enough to guarantee a massive felony conviction. A high-priced defense attorney could easily argue that Grandpa had simply experienced a moment of sudden clarity, or that someone had legally guided his hand. That is exactly when I reached into my purse and pulled out the tiny plastic case containing the hidden nanny camera memory card. I handed the small flash drive to the detective and watched as he inserted it into his secure police laptop. I directed him to the specific timestamp on the day my grandfather suffered his fatal heart attack. The small room went completely silent as the high-definition video began to play on the screen. Detective Reynolds sat perfectly still, his eyes locked intensely on the footage. He watched my brother and his wife walk into the dark bedroom with the corrupt notary. He listened to the crystal-clear audio of Maya coldly stating that dead men cannot testify in court. He watched Jason aggressively pull our unconscious, dying grandfather from beneath his warm blankets. He saw my brother forcefully press our grandfather's frail thumb into the black ink pad and stamp it directly onto the bottom of their fraudulent document. The sheer predatory malice radiating from the screen was absolutely suffocating. When the short video clip finally ended, Detective Reynolds slowly closed his laptop. He looked at me with an expression of profound, absolute disgust, mixed with genuine professional respect. He told me that in his 20 years of investigating severe financial crimes, he had never seen a piece of evidence so completely devastating and flawlessly captured. He confirmed that Jason and Maya were not just looking at a minor civil dispute over an inheritance. They had actively committed grand larceny, massive wire fraud, severe elder abuse, and felony conspiracy. But we could not just arrest them in their luxury penthouse based on the video alone. Detective Reynolds explained that to ensure they faced the absolute maximum federal sentencing guidelines, we needed them to voluntarily cross the point of no return. We needed them to actively present the forged document in a formal legal setting and officially attempt to execute the fraudulent transfer of the $20 million blind trust. We needed them to firmly lock the handcuffs around their own wrists. This is exactly where Grandpa William's true brilliant estate attorney, Jessica Monroe, became the ultimate architect of our secret alliance. I had introduced Detective Reynolds to Jessica, and the three of us had spent hours completely turning Jason's arrogant victory lap into an inescapable legal slaughterhouse. Jessica explained that Jason had specifically demanded the formal will reading take place at Maya's corporate real estate office downtown because he wanted to completely dominate the environment. He wanted to sit at the head of a massive mahogany table, surrounded by glass walls and expensive artwork, projecting the ultimate image of untouchable power, while he forced me to sign away my rights for a pathetic $50,000 bribe. He thought he was entirely controlling the battlefield. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed us the absolute perfect isolated location to spring a massive coordinated police sting operation. Under the strict guidance of the Financial Fraud Division, Jessica Monroe officially accepted Jason's invitation to attend the reading as the final executor of the estate. Jason firmly believed she was simply an old, clueless lawyer showing up to rubber stamp his beautiful forged document and hand over the keys to the $20 million kingdom. He completely assumed her presence would add the final necessary layer of legal legitimacy to his massive criminal scheme. What he did not know was that the local police department had actively coordinated with the building security team entirely behind his back. The massive glass-walled corporate boardroom Maya had booked for the occasion was currently completely wired for sound and high-definition video. Every single arrogant word they spoke, every single fraudulent paper they slid across the polished mahogany table, and every single threat they made against me would be captured live by multiple hidden cameras and transmitted directly to a police surveillance van parked discreetly in the underground loading dock. Furthermore, Detective Reynolds and two other plainclothes fraud investigators were already inside the building. They were currently sitting quietly in a vacant executive office located exactly directly across the hall from the boardroom. They were drinking bad office coffee and waiting patiently for the absolute perfect moment to strike. All they needed was for Jason to officially present the forged will as a genuine legal document, and for Maya to offer me the illegal financial bribe in exchange for my permanent silence. The very second that specific criminal transaction occurred, the trap would violently snap shut. I pulled my reliable old car into the expansive underground parking garage of Maya's luxury corporate building. The tires squeaked loudly against the polished concrete floor as I found a parking spot sandwiched between a massive black luxury SUV and a sleek imported sports car. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet, damp darkness of the garage for a long moment, taking a deep, steadying breath. I looked down at the absolutely hideous stained yellow thrift store dress covering my body. It smelled faintly of cheap detergent and ancient dust despite my desperate attempts to wash it. Maya had intentionally sent me this disgusting garment to completely humiliate me and shatter any remaining ounce of dignity I held. She wanted me to walk into that pristine high-end corporate environment feeling like absolute worthless garbage. She wanted the wealthy executives passing by the glass walls to look at me with profound pity and disgust. I grabbed my small worn leather purse from the passenger seat, holding it tightly against my side. I smoothed my hands down the stained yellow fabric and actually let out a soft, genuine laugh. The dress was no longer a humiliating punishment. It was the absolute perfect, ultimate camouflage. I was walking into the lion's den, looking exactly like the broken, defeated prey they desperately wanted to devour. They were going to look at my pale face, my unbrushed hair, and my stained clothes, and they were going to feel an intense, blinding rush of pure, arrogant victory. They were going to drop every single ounce of caution because they genuinely believed they had already completely destroyed my life. I stepped out of my car and walked slowly toward the bright, polished steel of the elevator bank. The cold air of the garage bit against my bare legs, but the intense, fiery focus burning in my chest kept me entirely warm. I pressed the upward arrow button, watching the digital numbers slowly descend toward the basement level. My grandfather had spent his entire life working incredibly hard to protect our family from the toxic, corrupting influence of unearned wealth. He had known exactly what Jason and Maya were truly capable of, and he had trusted me to finish the silent war he had meticulously started. I stepped into the bright, mirrored elevator box entirely alone. The heavy metal doors slid smoothly shut, sealing me inside as the carriage began its rapid ascent toward the top floor. I was fully prepared to walk into that massive, expensive glass boardroom, put on the absolute performance of a lifetime, and watch the two most ruthless people I had ever known permanently destroy their entire glamorous lives with their own overwhelming, uncontrollable greed. I stood perfectly still outside the massive frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom. My reflection stared back at me in the highly polished glass, and I almost did not recognize the woman looking back. The incredibly hideous mustard yellow thrift store dress hung off my shoulders like a wet, heavy blanket. The dark brown oil stain on the pleated skirt was completely impossible to ignore, and the fabric smelled faintly of ancient mothballs and cheap chemical detergent. I looked exactly like a completely shattered, financially ruined victim who had absolutely nowhere else to turn in this world. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the heavily air-conditioned, incredibly sterile air of Maya's downtown luxury real estate firm. I reached out and pushed the heavy metal handles, feeling the doors glide open with a soft, expensive swoosh. The boardroom was an absolute masterclass in aggressive modern corporate wealth. The floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire far wall, offering a completely unobstructed, dizzying view of the sprawling Chicago skyline. The bright afternoon sunlight poured into the room, directly illuminating the massive, polished mahogany conference table that dominated the absolute center of the space. Sitting at the very head of that incredibly expensive darkwood table were Jason and Maya. They looked absolutely radiant, completely dripping in high-end designer clothing and projecting a suffocating aura of unearned victory. Maya was lounging comfortably in a plush white leather executive chair, wearing a pristine bone-white designer dress that probably cost more than my entire first year of college tuition. Thick, heavy diamond bracelets were stacked along her wrist, clinking loudly against the mahogany wood every single time she moved her arms. She was holding her sleek, oversized smartphone in one perfectly manicured hand, completely ignoring my entrance as she actively scrolled through a digital catalog of custom luxury vehicles. I could easily see the bright, glossy images of brand new Porsches reflecting clearly in the polished surface of the table right in front of her. She was already actively shopping with the $20 million she deeply believed she had just successfully stolen from our dead grandfather. Beside her, Jason was the absolute picture of arrogant corporate confidence. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit with a crisp silk tie, his dark hair styled perfectly to project the polished image of a serious elite wealth manager. In the corner of the room, resting on an elegant silver serving cart, sat a heavy crystal ice bucket, chilling a highly expensive bottle of vintage champagne, waiting to be popped the very second I signed my life away. When the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind me, the sound echoed loudly in the cavernous room. Jason looked up from his leather-bound notepad, and a slow, incredibly smug smirk spread across his face. He nudged Maya gently with his elbow. She finally tore her eyes away from her bright Porsche catalog and looked directly down the length of the table at me. I watched her perfectly outlined eyes slowly travel up and down my body, taking in the frayed collar, the baggy shoulders, and the horrific dark oil stain on the skirt of the thrift store dress she had maliciously sent to my apartment. The sheer unadulterated joy that exploded across her beautiful face was absolutely sickening to witness. She literally let out a sharp, cruel laugh that bounced off the expensive glass walls. She loudly mocked my appearance, telling me that the dress suited me perfectly and that it was an incredibly accurate visual representation of my completely pathetic, empty bank account and my failing, permanently ruined career. I forced my shoulders to slump dramatically inward. I completely lowered my gaze to the plush, corporate carpet, letting my hands tremble slightly at my sides. I played the role of the totally defeated, completely broken little sister with absolute terrifying perfection. I silently walked toward the opposite end of the massive mahogany table and pulled out a heavy leather chair. I sat down, placing my worn, cheap purse carefully on my lap. Inside that purse was the hidden camera flash drive and the true legal documentation verified by Jessica Monroe. I knew with absolute, undeniable certainty that tiny hidden police surveillance cameras were actively recording every single corner of this glass-walled boardroom. I knew that Detective Reynolds and a team of seasoned financial fraud investigators were sitting in a dark office exactly across the hallway, listening intently to every single cruel, humiliating word Maya and Jason were currently speaking. The intense burning knowledge of their impending catastrophic destruction was the absolute only thing keeping me from leaping across the table and completely losing my professional composure. Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows aggressively on the dark, polished wood. He laced his fingers together, staring at me with cold, dead eyes that held absolutely zero trace of the little brother I used to know growing up. He completely dropped the fake grieving grandson routine he had posted all over Facebook. There was no extended family in this room to perform for, or so he foolishly thought. He spoke to me in a harsh, incredibly condescending tone, treating me exactly like a stray dog begging for table scraps. He loudly announced that they were incredibly busy, important people and did not have the patience or the time to waste on my emotional, dramatic outbursts today. He proudly stated that the legal transfer of Grandpa William's entire estate into his own personal corporate holding accounts was already actively in motion. He shamelessly bragged for the hidden police microphones that the massive blind trust containing over $20 million in prime commercial real estate was exactly where it belonged, in the capable hands of a superior, successful businessman who actually knew how to multiply generational wealth, rather than a glorified maid who just cooked cheap soup. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, thick stack of legal documents. It was the exact same fraudulent package they had shoved in my face at the artisan coffee shop days ago. Sitting right on top was the incredibly crucial, comprehensive legal waiver they desperately, critically needed me to sign. The specific waiver that would permanently legally strip me of my absolute right to ever contest their incredibly crude, forged, handwritten will in any probate court. Jason smoothed the papers flat against the mahogany table, completely unaware that he was loudly, actively confessing to massive federal crimes into a live police surveillance feed. He told me this was my absolute final chance. He stated incredibly clearly that if I signed my name on the dotted line permanently surrendering my legal rights to the entire estate, he would immediately authorize a wire transfer of exactly $50,000 directly into my checking account. He called it a generous final severance package for my deeply unappreciated caregiving services. Maya set her smartphone face down on the table, clearly annoyed that she had to pause her luxury car shopping to deal with me. She leaned forward, her heavy, expensive designer perfume drifting across the wide table directly into my face, completely suffocating the air. She looked at my stained yellow dress with absolute, unfiltered disgust. She told me to stop being a stubborn, ungrateful idiot and just take the pathetic pity money before they decided to withdraw the offer entirely. She actively, maliciously reminded me that thanks to her direct phone call, my accounting firm had completely fired me, and I was currently absolutely penniless and entirely unemployable in the corporate world of Chicago. She twisted the psychological knife even deeper, violently mocking the years I spent cooking warm meals and managing vital medications for a dying old man, who she claimed hated me enough to cut me completely out of his final handwritten will. She demanded I pick up the pen, sign the paper, and walk out of their beautiful, perfect, wealthy lives forever, so they could finally pop that expensive bottle of vintage champagne and celebrate their massive, hard-earned inheritance. Jason reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, expensive gold fountain pen. He placed it precisely in the absolute dead center of the crisp, white legal waiver. With a totally, completely arrogant flick of his wrist, he pushed the document directly across the incredibly long, polished mahogany table. The thick paper made a sharp scratching sound as it glided rapidly over the dark wood, coming to a complete stop exactly 1 inch away from my trembling hands. The heavy gold pen rolled slightly, catching the bright afternoon sunlight pouring through the massive windows. Jason sat back in his plush white leather chair, crossing his arms tightly over his custom-tailored chest. He stared at me with an expression of total absolute victory, entirely confident that he had completely broken my spirit and backed me into an entirely inescapable corner. He demanded I sign the paper immediately and take my pathetic money. I stared down at the blank signature line, listening to the quiet, steady humming of the corporate air conditioning, feeling the entire massive glass room holding its collective breath as the invisible trap completely closed around them. I sat completely motionless in the incredibly plush white leather executive chair, staring down at the thick stack of fraudulent legal documents Jason had just pushed across the massive polished mahogany table. The heavy, expensive gold fountain pen rested directly in the center of the crisp white signature waiver, catching the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of Maya's downtown luxury real estate firm. The silence in the cavernous corporate boardroom was absolutely suffocating. Maya was openly ignoring me, casually leaning back in her chair and scrolling through a high-resolution digital catalog of custom luxury Porsche vehicles on her oversized smartphone. The heavy stack of incredibly expensive diamond bracelets wrapped around her wrist clinked loudly against the dark wood every single time she swiped her perfectly manicured finger across the screen. She was already actively happily spending the $20 million she completely believed she had just successfully stolen from our dead grandfather. Jason sat beside her, radiating a sickening aura of unearned triumph. He adjusted his flawless, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit jacket and cleared his throat, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh of pure annoyance. He rudely tapped his finger against the edge of the mahogany table, explicitly demanding that I stop wasting their highly valuable corporate time and simply sign away my entire life for their pathetic $50,000 bribe. Standing right behind Jason, shifting nervously from foot to foot, was the exact same heavy-set man I had seen in the hidden nanny camera footage. It was their corrupt notary. He was wearing the same cheap, wrinkled gray suit, sweating profusely under the bright overhead lights of the boardroom. He reached into his dark leather briefcase and pulled out his heavy official brass notary stamp, gripping it tightly in his clammy hand. He stepped forward, preparing to permanently, completely validate the incredibly malicious extortion currently happening in front of him. He raised the heavy brass stamp, hovering it slightly above the table, just waiting for me to pick up the gold pen and officially surrender my absolute right to Grandpa William's massive financial legacy. Jason smiled an incredibly cold, lifeless smile, completely certain that he had backed me into an entirely inescapable corner. He actually had the absolute sheer audacity to lean forward and tell me that I was making the smartest financial decision of my otherwise completely pathetic and useless life. I kept my head bowed, letting my unbrushed hair fall forward to hide my face. I gripped the fabric of the incredibly hideous stained mustard yellow thrift store dress Maya had maliciously sent to me, using it as the absolute perfect disguise for the intense fiery anticipation actively coursing through my entire body. I did not reach for the expensive gold pen. I did not shed a single tear. I just sat there counting the agonizingly slow seconds in my head, waiting for the absolute perfect moment for the trap to violently snap completely shut. Just as the corrupt, sweating notary raised his heavy brass stamp a fraction higher to forcefully clear his throat, the massive frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom suddenly swung open with an incredibly loud, heavy, metallic crash. The sudden violent sound completely shattered the arrogant corporate silence of the room. Maya violently jumped in her plush leather chair, entirely dropping her expensive smartphone onto the hard mahogany table with a sharp, clattering sound. Jason instantly spun around, his smug, confident smile completely freezing on his face. Walking through the wide, open doorway with absolute terrifying authority was Jessica Monroe. She wore a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, holding a heavy vintage leather briefcase tightly in her steady hands. Her silver hair was elegantly styled back, and her dark, intelligent eyes swept across the massive glass-walled room with an expression of pure, unadulterated, professional disgust. But she did not walk into that lion's den alone. Flanking her on either side were two towering, heavily armed, uniformed Chicago police officers, their tactical radios crackling softly in the tense, quiet air. Walking directly behind them, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his dark trench coat, was Detective Reynolds from the Financial Crimes Division. The entire atmosphere inside the sprawling corporate boardroom instantly dramatically shifted from arrogant victory to absolute suffocating confusion. Jason immediately shot up out of his chair, his face flushing a bright, angry shade of red. He aggressively buttoned his custom suit jacket, trying desperately to project the image of a powerful, untouchable corporate executive. He loudly demanded to know exactly who they were and how they had managed to bypass the strict security desk in the lobby. He angrily shouted that this was a highly confidential private family legal proceeding and that they were actively trespassing in a booked corporate space. Maya stood up right next to him, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, her flawless designer facade beginning to crack just slightly. She explicitly threatened to call the building management and have them immediately forcefully dragged out by the property security team. She screamed that they were interrupting a multi-million-dollar real estate transition and that heads were absolutely going to roll for this ridiculous, massive intrusion. Jessica Monroe completely ignored their frantic, arrogant shouting. She walked slowly and deliberately down the entire length of the massive mahogany table, completely bypassing Jason and Maya. She stopped directly in front of the empty space at the head of the table, set her heavy leather briefcase down on the polished wood, and snapped the brass locks open with 2 loud, sharp clicks. She looked directly into Jason's panicked, angry eyes and introduced herself with an icy, completely unwavering tone. She stated her name clearly and formally, announced that she was the senior managing partner of Monroe Wealth Management and the sole exclusively authorized legal executor of the estate of William Harper. She explicitly informed them that she had held that specific confidential position for over 30 years. The loud, arrogant blustering instantly completely died in Jason's throat. His mouth actually hung open slightly as his brain frantically tried to process the terrifying reality that the poor old man he had completely abandoned actually had a high-powered elite wealth management attorney operating silently behind the scenes. Detective Reynolds casually stepped forward, pulling his gold police shield from his pocket and letting it flash brightly under the boardroom lights. He looked directly at the sweating, corrupt notary, who was currently trying to slowly, completely back away toward the open glass doors, and told him to absolutely stay exactly where he was standing. Maya's voice wavered slightly as she aggressively pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the fraudulent papers sitting on the table. She completely doubled down on her massive criminal lie, frantically claiming that Jessica had absolutely no legal authority in this room. She loudly insisted that they possessed William's true legally binding final handwritten testament, entirely leaving everything to Jason. She aggressively demanded that the police officers arrest me for causing a ridiculous, unnecessary scene and trying to dispute a legally sealed family matter. Jessica Monroe did not even look at the crude, forged document. She did not even acknowledge Maya's desperate, screeching threats. Instead, she reached deeply into her vintage leather briefcase and slowly pulled out a thick, heavily aged manila envelope. The envelope was firmly, securely sealed with a massive dollop of dark red wax, bearing the official embossed insignia of a highly secure downtown private bank vault. She held the thick envelope up in the bright sunlight, ensuring that every single person in the room could clearly, plainly see the unbroken, ancient wax seal. The entire room went absolutely deathly quiet. You could practically hear a pin drop on the thick corporate carpet. Jessica looked around the room, her incredibly sharp gaze cutting entirely through Jason and Maya's fake, wealthy posturing. She stated incredibly clearly that the sealed envelope she was holding had been completely securely locked inside William Harper's primary bank vault for the last 5 years. She explained that she was operating under extremely strict, explicit legal instructions dictated by my grandfather. She was strictly ordered to only break the red wax seal and read the enclosed document aloud if and only if a conflicting, highly suspicious will was presented by any member of the family immediately following his death. Jason's face completely drained of all its healthy color, instantly transforming into an incredibly sickly pale shade of chalk white. He took a very small, trembling step backward, bumping roughly against the edge of his plush, white leather chair. Maya stopped breathing entirely, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that her knuckles completely locked. Jessica hooked her index finger under the flap of the thick envelope and forcefully broke the heavy red wax seal. The sharp snapping sound echoed violently through the silent glass-walled boardroom. She reached inside and pulled out 3 crisp white pages, covered entirely in Grandpa William's authentic, distinctively shaky, heavily arthritic cursive handwriting. She smoothed the pages flat on the table, adjusted her silver reading glasses, and began to read his true final words aloud. As her strong, steady voice filled the corporate space, I completely closed my eyes and instantly heard my grandfather speaking directly to me from the grave. The letter began by formally officially establishing the existence of his massive $20 million commercial real estate blind trust, detailing exactly how he had accumulated the wealth and why he had chosen to keep it a complete, absolute secret from his deeply flawed, greedy family. He explained his profound belief that unearned massive wealth completely corrupts the human soul and destroys the fundamental sacred bonds of family loyalty. Then the tone of the letter sharply, devastatingly shifted. Jessica's voice dropped into a cold, incredibly precise register as she read Grandpa's explicit, detailed observations of Jason and Maya. The words were absolutely uncompromising and brutally honest. Grandpa explicitly wrote that he always completely knew Jason and Maya were just entirely waiting for him to finally die. He detailed exactly how they had treated him with absolute, complete disgust, refusing to visit him, mocking his simple lifestyle, and throwing away the hot meals I had lovingly prepared for him. He wrote that he recognized the deep, intense, toxic greed festering inside my brother's heart, and he fully, completely anticipated this exact, specific, horrific betrayal. He explicitly detailed how he had purposefully, deliberately left tiny, vague breadcrumbs and confusing tax documents around his house, entirely knowing that Jason's extreme, unchecked arrogance and desperate hunger for unearned corporate wealth would eventually drive him to snoop through his private mail. I opened my eyes and watched Jason completely, physically unraveling in real time. The expensive, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket, completely suffocating his trembling body. Thick, heavy beads of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, dripping slowly down the side of his pale, terrified face. Maya was completely, entirely frozen. Her flawless designer makeup could not hide the absolute, sheer, unadulterated horror expanding rapidly across her wide eyes. The beautiful white dress she was wearing suddenly looked completely ridiculous, entirely inappropriate for the massive legal execution she was currently enduring. Jessica took a deep breath, holding the final page of the authentic letter perfectly steady in her hands. She read the absolute final, devastating paragraph that completely sealed their catastrophic fate. Grandpa William's words echoed with absolute, terrifying clarity. He wrote that if this specific letter is currently being read aloud in a room, it absolutely means that Jason and Maya have illegally attempted to present a forged fake document to steal my estate. He explicitly stated that they were operating under the false, arrogant assumption that they were far smarter than a dying old man. He then wrote the 7 absolute most destructive words they would ever hear in their entire lives. Look at the air purifier. Everything is on camera. Is on. The color completely, violently drained entirely out of Maya's flawless face. She literally, physically swayed on her feet, letting out a sharp, pathetic gasping sound as the absolute crushing reality of those 7 words completely slammed into her brain. She instantly, vividly remembered standing in the dark bedroom, coldly telling Jason to use the ink pad on an unconscious, dying man. She realized in one single, horrifying heartbeat that every single second of their massive felony conspiracy, their complete elder abuse, and their undeniable grand larceny had been perfectly, flawlessly recorded in high-definition video. Jason began to violently stammer, his mouth opening and closing rapidly like a suffocating fish, completely unable to form a single coherent, recognizable word. His knees began to violently shake, his legs literally physically giving out completely beneath his body weight. He crashed backward heavily into the plush white leather executive chair, letting out a soft, pathetic whimpering sound that was entirely devoid of any corporate arrogance or elite power. The heavy, sweating corrupt notary, standing completely frozen by the glass doors, let out a terrified, whimpering groan. The heavy brass notary stamp completely slipped out of his clammy, shaking fingers, dropping through the air and clattering incredibly loudly against the polished mahogany table, bouncing twice before rolling entirely onto the thick carpet. He tried desperately to take another very small step backward toward the hallway, but one of the massive uniformed Chicago police officers instantly stepped directly into his path, placing a heavy tactical gloved hand firmly squarely against the center of his cheap gray suit chest, completely trapping him inside the room. I sat quietly at the opposite end of the massive table, completely wrapped in the ugly stained yellow thrift store dress they had maliciously used to mock my poverty. I did not move a single muscle. I simply looked directly at my deeply terrified broken brother and his completely ruined, arrogant wife, knowing with absolute, pure, crystal clear certainty that their perfect, glamorous, wealthy, untouchable lives were completely, entirely, officially over. The heavy, suffocating silence inside the massive glass-walled corporate boardroom was abruptly shattered by the firm, commanding voice of Detective Reynolds. He stepped completely out of the shadows of the open doorway, and his polished gold police shield caught the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He did not yell, and he did not rush his movements. He simply walked directly toward Jason and Maya with the absolute terrifying certainty of a man who had already entirely won the war. He instructed the two towering uniformed police officers to move forward and secure the room. They advanced with heavy, synchronized steps, their tactical boots thudding loudly against the plush corporate carpet. Jason was still violently shaking in his plush white leather executive chair, his custom-tailored charcoal gray suit now completely soaked in cold, terrified sweat. He raised his trembling hands defensively as one of the officers grabbed his arm, pulling him roughly to his feet. Detective Reynolds looked Jason directly in his panicked, shifting eyes and clearly calmly recited the devastating list of criminal charges. He formally loudly arrested my brother for massive felony fraud, severe elder abuse, grand larceny, and deeply coordinated criminal conspiracy. The incredibly satisfying metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around Jason's wrists echoed loudly through the entire room. In that exact fraction of a second, every single ounce of my brother's arrogant corporate posturing completely evaporated into thin air. He instantly, desperately tried to save himself by violently throwing his own wife entirely under the bus. He began sobbing uncontrollably and frantically babbling to the detective, claiming that he had absolutely no idea what was happening and that the forged will was entirely Maya's malicious idea. He aggressively pointed his cuffed hands at her, screaming that she was the one who found the corrupt, sweating notary and that she was the one who physically forced him to participate in the horrifying scheme against our grandfather. He looked absolutely pathetic, a completely broken coward, desperately begging for a plea deal before he had even been escorted out of the building. Maya, however, was an entirely different story. When the second towering police officer approached her chair, she completely violently snapped. The flawless, icy corporate facade she had meticulously maintained for her entire adult life completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. As the officer grabbed her arms to securely lock the handcuffs behind her back, Maya let out a piercing, hysterical scream that physically vibrated against the massive glass windows. It was not a dignified or quiet cry. It was an incredibly ugly, guttural wail of pure, unadulterated terror and absolute blinding disbelief. She aggressively thrashed against the officer, her incredibly expensive, heavy diamond bracelets clanking violently against the cold, unforgiving steel of the police handcuffs. She screamed that they were making a catastrophic mistake, that she was a highly respected, elite real estate executive, and that her massive team of high-priced downtown lawyers would entirely destroy the police department. But absolutely nobody in the room cared about her empty, screaming threats. The cold, hard reality of the situation was physically locking her into place. She was no longer a wealthy, untouchable socialite. She was a deeply common criminal who had just been caught on high-definition hidden camera actively abusing a dying, vulnerable man. I sat perfectly still in my cheap-stained mustard yellow thrift store dress, silently watching the absolute total destruction of their entire glamorous universe. As the police forcefully dragged Jason and Maya toward the heavy, frosted glass doors, I looked past them and saw a massive crowd of elite corporate executives and wealthy clients gathering in the outer hallway. Maya had intentionally booked this incredibly visible glass-walled boardroom to publicly humiliate me and showcase her dominant victory. Now that exact same transparent glass was completely exposing her horrific downfall to every single important person in her professional network. The wealthy clients she had spent years aggressively courting were openly staring at her with profound, absolute disgust as she was paraded through her own luxury office, completely covered in ruined makeup and screaming like a hysterical child. Her carefully curated, pristine reputation was instantly, permanently dead. She would never sell another piece of luxury real estate in Chicago ever again. They were both going to absolutely lose their massive penthouses, their imported sports cars, their elite country club memberships, and their precious freedom. They had tried to steal $20 million, and they were currently walking away with absolutely nothing but matching heavy steel handcuffs and guaranteed lengthy federal prison sentences. When the heavy glass doors finally clicked shut behind the police escort, the chaotic screaming slowly faded down the long corporate hallway, leaving the boardroom completely bathed in a warm, peaceful silence. It was just me and Jessica Monroe left sitting at the massive, polished mahogany table. I let out a long, trembling breath, feeling the massive, suffocating weight of the last 15 years completely lift off my exhausted shoulders. I looked down at my hands and realized I was no longer shaking. Jessica offered me a very soft, incredibly genuine smile. She reached across the table, gently pushing Jason's ridiculous forged documents entirely out of the way, letting them fall into the trash where they belonged. She picked up the final crisp white page of Grandpa William's authentic true letter, holding it carefully in her steady hands. She told me that the police had their absolute, undeniable evidence to put them away for a very long time, but we still needed to formally, officially conclude the legal reading of the actual estate. She adjusted her silver reading glasses, and her voice filled the quiet room with an incredible, comforting warmth. She proceeded to read the final legally binding clause of the massive blind trust. She explicitly, officially stated that exactly 100% of the $20 million commercial real estate portfolio, the liquid investment accounts, and the highly valuable downtown properties were left entirely, solely, and permanently to me. There were no confusing stipulations, no hidden corporate clauses, and absolutely no contested assets. My grandfather had meticulously structured the entire massive financial empire to completely bypass the standard, slow probate courts, transferring absolute total control directly to my name, the very second the legal trap had been successfully sprung on Jason and Maya. I was officially, immediately, undeniably a multi-millionaire. I had walked into this building believing I had nothing, and now I possessed the ultimate freedom to design my own life. But the massive, staggering amount of money did not make me cry. It was the absolute final, beautiful sentence my grandfather had written at the very bottom of the page that completely broke my heart wide open. Jessica paused for a brief second, letting the bright sunlight warm the pages in her hands. She looked directly into my eyes and read his final, absolute true words aloud. To Harper, the only one who loved a poor old man without ever needing to know what he had. Hearing my name spoken in that exact context, hearing his profound, absolute recognition of my genuine, unconditional love completely shattered the thick, emotional wall I had built around myself to survive the last terrible week. The hot, heavy tears finally freely fell down my pale cheeks, dropping silently onto the frayed collar of the incredibly ugly yellow dress. I did not try to aggressively wipe them away. I just sat there completely absorbing the immense, beautiful truth of his final message. He had seen every single quiet sacrifice I ever made. He had noticed every grueling late-night commute, every carefully cooked meal, and every single moment I had chosen to simply sit beside him in his modest living room, asking for absolutely nothing but his quiet company. He knew I genuinely loved him when I firmly believed he was entirely penniless, and he completely rewarded that pure, unselfish loyalty with a massive financial legacy that would entirely, permanently alter the trajectory of my entire life. I walked out of that towering downtown corporate skyscraper a completely, totally different woman. I stepped out into the busy, bustling Chicago streets, and the cold wind actually felt incredibly fresh and deeply reviving against my face. I was wearing a deeply humiliating, stained, oversized thrift store dress, but I suddenly genuinely felt like I was wearing a priceless royal gown. I had absolutely nothing left to hide, and absolutely nothing left to fear. I knew the incredibly grueling legal process would take several long weeks to completely finalize, but the intense, vicious war was officially entirely over. Jason and Maya were currently sitting in cold, sterile concrete, holding cells completely stripped of their designer clothes and their stolen arrogance, desperately facing the absolute total ruin of their entire existence. They had completely shown me exactly who they truly were, and I was incredibly happy to permanently, aggressively cut every single one of them out of my incredibly bright new future. I was going to deeply honor Grandpa William's incredible legacy by actively building a highly successful private firm, specifically strictly dedicated to uncovering severe elder financial abuse and legally aggressively protecting vulnerable families from corporate predators, exactly like my brother. I was going to take the immense, profound pain I had survived and actively turn it into a massive, highly protective shield for people who could not fight for themselves. If you have completely followed this intense, deeply personal journey with me, all the way to the absolute end, I want to explicitly directly ask you a very important question. Have you ever completely selflessly loved someone without ever expecting a single tangible reward, only to unexpectedly deeply discover that your quiet, unseen loyalty was actually secretly recognized all along? The most profound, absolute truth I learned from this entire horrifying ordeal is that genuine, pure love never ever requires a massive bank account, and toxic, intense greed will always inevitably, permanently destroy the exact people who worship it. You completely, absolutely have the right to permanently, aggressively walk away from toxic, highly abusive family members who treat you like a worthless, disposable burden. Setting incredibly firm, strict boundaries and demanding basic human respect is never an act of betrayal. It is an act of pure, necessary survival. Please take a very quick moment right now to hit that like button and actively subscribe to the channel if this deeply emotional story genuinely meant something real to you. It actually incredibly helps this specific video reach other people who might desperately need to hear exactly this profound message of hope and absolute justice. Please drop a comment down below right now, letting me specifically deeply know the exact city, state, or country where you are currently watching this video from and the exact local time on your clock. I absolutely love reading every single one of your incredibly supportive comments and deeply connecting with this beautiful, amazing community we have built together. Always constantly remember that your personal worth is absolutely never, ever determined by the deeply toxic, broken people who fail to see your true value. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and please take wonderful care of yourself until next time. It has been exactly 4 months since that incredibly chaotic afternoon inside the massive glass-walled corporate boardroom. The dust has finally settled, and the profound, beautiful silence that has entirely replaced the constant toxic noise of my extended family is absolutely intoxicating. Jason and Maya are currently sitting in a cold, sterile county jail, completely stripped of their expensive designer clothes and their arrogant corporate titles. They are actively awaiting a massive federal trial for grand larceny, severe elder financial abuse, and coordinated criminal conspiracy. The towering stack of undeniable high-definition video evidence and the terrified cooperating notary testimonies completely guarantee they are facing incredibly lengthy prison sentences. A few of my extended family members actually had the sheer absolute audacity to call me begging me to show some mercy and post their massive bail. They hysterically claimed that prison would completely destroy Jason and Maya, and that family should always forgive family, no matter what terrible things happen. I listened to their frantic pleading for exactly 1 minute before I calmly told them that adult actions have permanent legal consequences. I hung up the phone and permanently blocked every single one of their numbers. No, I absolutely did not bail them out. I let them sit in the exact same dark, terrifying isolation they maliciously tried to force upon me. They completely lost their massive luxury penthouses, their imported sports cars, their elite country club memberships, and their precious freedom. They walked away from their incredibly greedy criminal scheme with absolutely nothing but matching heavy steel handcuffs and a totally permanently ruined reputation. That same week, I walked directly back into the downtown accounting firm that had immediately suspended me based on Maya's vicious phone call. My managing partner, Mr. Sterling, looked completely shocked to see me. He had already seen the explosive local news reports about Maya's massive, highly public arrest and the absolute total collapse of her luxury real estate empire. He actually had the absolute nerve to offer me my old cubicle back, along with a very small, pathetic raise, hoping to sweep his massive, cowardly mistake completely under the rug. I stood in his plush corner office, looking at the man who had effortlessly thrown my entire career away just to secure a lucrative corporate contract. I reached into my bag, pulled out my formal letter of resignation, and slid it directly across his polished desk. I told him I no longer had any desire to work for a company that valued flashy corporate wealth over basic human integrity. Walking out of those heavy glass lobby doors for the very last time felt like breathing pure, clean oxygen after completely drowning for 5 incredibly long, grueling years. I realized that surviving their intense psychological warfare had completely reshaped my entire identity. I was no longer the quiet, submissive caregiver, desperately begging for scraps of basic human decency from people who possessed absolutely zero empathy. I was an incredibly strong, financially independent woman who had successfully navigated an absolute nightmare and emerged entirely victorious. I took the massive $20 million blind trust Grandpa William left solely to me and completely changed the entire trajectory of my life. I bought a beautiful quiet house in the suburbs, surrounded by ancient oak trees, exactly like the ones Grandpa used to love. But more importantly, I took a significant portion of that immense inheritance and officially established the William Harper Legal Aid Foundation. We are a dedicated, fierce team of aggressive attorneys and financial auditors who specifically step in to aggressively protect vulnerable elderly people from severe financial abuse. Every single day, we actively hunt down the corporate predators and the deeply greedy, toxic family members who desperately try to exploit the exact same defenseless people my grandfather wanted to protect. We provide absolute top-tier legal representation entirely free of charge, ensuring that no vulnerable person ever has to face an incredibly terrifying eviction or forced signature alone. Every single time we completely dismantle a fraudulent will or send a toxic abuser to a cold prison cell, I can actually feel Grandpa William smiling down at me. I am finally completely free from the heavy, crushing chains of my toxic biological family. I am entirely at peace, and I am waking up every single morning living a life of absolute profound purpose. If I learned anything from this entire, horrifying, incredibly traumatic experience, it is exactly this. Family is not always about sharing the exact same bloodline, but it is the incredibly loyal people who step up to fiercely protect you when you are at your absolute most vulnerable. Setting incredibly firm, strict boundaries and actively walking away from deeply toxic, abusive people is never an act of selfish betrayal. It is an act of pure, necessary survival. And sometimes, choosing to stay completely silent in the face of incredible cruelty does not mean you are weak or defeated. It simply means you are quietly, meticulously preparing a massive, devastating counterattack they will absolutely never see coming. You completely have the power to entirely rewrite your own story and protect your own peace. If you genuinely felt a deep, profound sense of justice watching Jason and Maya get exactly what they absolutely deserved today, please take a quick second to hit that like button and actively subscribe to the channel to support me and these stories. Your incredible support genuinely helps this channel grow and reach other people who might desperately need to hear exactly this specific message of hope today. And I would absolutely love to hear directly from you right now in the comments down below. What specific state or beautiful country are you currently watching this video from today, and exactly what time is it there right now on your clock? I actively read and deeply appreciate every single comment you leave for me. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today, and please always constantly remember this. Never let anyone ever make you feel invisible or worthless. You are absolutely entirely enough exactly as you are.